Your boss lives in a palace. You live in a broom closet that doesn't even belong to you. Welcome to servant life in Victorian Britain, where the difference between upstairs and downstairs wasn't just about which direction you were walking. It was a whole social order carved into wood, stone, and etiquette manuals, thicker than your pillow, which, by the way, is stuffed with hay and disappointment. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The grand Victorian mansion was a kind of living organism. Upstairs, it glittered with chandeliers, fine china, and people who believed moving their own teacup was a crime against nature. Downstairs, it wheezed, coughed, and sweated with the effort of dozens of servants working like human cogs in a gigantic, over-decorated machine. If the lords and ladies were the face of the household, then servants were the skeleton, muscles, and occasionally the overstrained spine. To a Victorian servant, upstairs was like stepping onto another planet. There were thick carpets muffling every footstep, portraits glaring down from the walls, and furniture so polished you could check your tragic reflection in it. But downstairs, that's where the real work and the real smells happened. Kitchens roasted, laundries steamed, sculleries clanged, and corridors echoed with the never-ending chorus of bells demanding someone fetch, carry, polish, or fix. And no matter how many hours you worked, 16, 18, sometimes 20, your employers rarely noticed you unless something went wrong. Drop a fork upstairs, and the mistress sighs as if you've just personally ruined Britain's empire. Deliver her tea perfectly, and she won't even glance at you. The unspoken motto of the Victorian servant: if you're invisible, you're doing it right. Hierarchy wasn't just between masters and servants, it existed among the servants themselves. Victorian houses were miniature societies. The butler reigned supreme over wine and status. The housekeeper ruled the female staff with iron keys, and below them cascaded a ladder of increasingly miserable jobs until you hit rock bottom. The scullery maid, scrubbing pots the size of bathtubs for pennies. Every servant had a place. Step outside of it, and you'd find yourself swiftly corrected, sometimes with a glare, sometimes with dismissal. A footman couldn't dream of bossing around a cook. A maid couldn't question the housekeeper, and no one dared to upset the butler. It was a rigid system that somehow managed to mirror Victorian society itself, a pyramid built on suffering, with rich people at the top enjoying cucumber sandwiches. If you imagined a quaint little servant's bedroom tucked neatly in the attic, let's adjust expectations. For many, room and board meant cramped dormitory-style quarters in the attic, the basement, or anywhere that wasn't visible to guests. Privacy. Forget it. You might share with 3 or 4 others, and the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor snore out his dreams of one day escaping into a slightly less awful job. And yet, this lodging was considered part of your wages. Think of it as Airbnb, but without choice, Wi-Fi, or basic human dignity. Why, you may ask? Would anyone subject themselves to this life of perpetual exhaustion, invisibility, and being yelled at for placing the dessert spoons at the wrong angle? Simple. Employment. For thousands of working-class Victorians, especially young women from rural families, going into service was one of the only jobs available that didn't involve a factory filled with spinning blades, or worse, no job at all. Service meant food, sort of, lodging, kind of, and wages barely. It also meant the vague chance of climbing the ladder, if you played your cards right, worked hard, and refrained from accidentally setting the drapes on fire. Some even hoped for better prospects after marriage, maybe, or escaping into another kind of work. But for many, service wasn't a stepping stone, it was the whole road. Here's the cruel irony. The wealthier the household, the more servants it required. The more servants a house had, the stricter the hierarchy became. So, in the very richest homes, servants had the least chance of moving upward. You might serve under dozens of others, polishing the polisher's silver, until you forgot what daylight felt like. Meanwhile, upstairs, the family prided themselves on running a respectable house. Translation, having so many servants that no one ever had to put on their own coat. Victorians even judged each other based on staff numbers. Forget having a yacht or a villa in the south of France. Real prestige was boasting, "We have 6 footmen and a boy just for polishing the doorknobs." One of the most punishing parts of servant life wasn't the hours or even the low pay. It was the wall between classes. Servants were expected to blend into the wallpaper, seen only as uniforms, not as people. You might overhear the family discussing politics, theatre or scandals, but your own opinion, worth less than the candlestick you just polished. Even in death, the division held. Wealthy families rested in elaborate mausoleums or family plots. Servants might be buried in unmarked graves, their years of labor swallowed by the soil as thoroughly as by the social system. So, welcome to Victorian service. You're about to embark on a career where your bosses will never remember your name. Your bed is a lumpy mattress in a damp attic, and your free time consists of falling asleep fully clothed before dawn arrives again. But hey, look on the bright side. You're alive. The bad news? So is your employer. Victorian mansions didn't just run on coal, candle wax, and the occasional roast beef. They ran on a carefully stacked pyramid of people whose job descriptions often sounded like they were invented by someone with too much time and a love of hierarchy charts. Life as a servant wasn't just about hard work. It was about knowing exactly where you stood in the pecking order. And make no mistake, even among servants, someone had to be the servant of the servants. At the very top of this world was the butler. He wasn't just the man in charge of pouring wine with a precision that rivaled a chemist. He was the gatekeeper of order. Every key in the house jingled on his watch. Every expensive bottle of port was catalogued in his memory. And every crisis, from missing silver to guests who arrived unannounced, landed squarely on his impeccably pressed shoulders. His posture alone was a message. Yes, I have more authority than you, and no, you may not touch the good sherry without my permission. The butler answered directly to the master of the house, making him as close to a mini monarch as you could get without owning the place. If the butler was the general, the housekeeper was the field marshal. She ruled the female staff with an iron set of keys dangling from her waist, and those keys weren't just symbolic. They unlocked linen closets, storerooms, and occasionally the souls of the poor girls who worked under her. A housekeeper had to be terrifyingly competent. She oversaw the endless rotation of dusting, mending, laundering, and bed-making. To displease her was to gamble with your job, your reference, and your dignity. Some said the mistress of the house was powerful, but every maid knew the housekeeper was the one who truly controlled your day-to-day survival. Next came the footman, and here's where things got odd. Footmen were selected not for skill, but for their ability to look good while standing around. Their duties included answering doors, serving meals, and carrying trays. But their real purpose was decorative. Guests judged a household by the appearance and number of footmen. So these men were basically the human equivalent of gilded picture frames. They wore liveried uniforms with shiny buttons, moved like chess pieces across the dining room floor, and were expected to have the kind of height and jawline you'd normally find in a romance novel. The catch? Despite being seen as glamorous, they were still ranked below the housekeeper and even the cook in authority. Being handsome was great for the guests, less great when it came to actual workplace power. Speaking of the cook, hers was a kingdom all its own. The kitchen was the beating heart of a Victorian household, and the cook commanded it like a queen who ruled with a ladle and sheer willpower. She planned menus, oversaw the roasting, boiling, baking, and fricasseeing of every meal, and shouted orders that could terrify even the boldest footman. If she liked you, she might slip you an extra crust of bread. If she didn't, you'd be dodging soup ladles while trying to keep your job. While her power didn't extend much beyond the kitchen door, inside it she was sovereign, and her temper could rival the heat of her ovens. Below the cook came the kitchen maids and parlour maids, who toiled like worker bees. Parlour maids kept the formal rooms spotless, arranging flowers, setting fires, and ensuring not a speck of dust dared settle in sight of the master. Kitchen maids, on the other hand, were essentially the cook's minions, chopping, stirring, fetching, and being yelled at when the sauce curdled. For them, the work never ended. The moment the family finished one meal, preparations for the next had already begun, and then at the very bottom lived the scullery maid. If servant life was a ladder, she wasn't even on the first rung. She was the one holding the ladder steady while everyone else climbed up. She scrubbed pots the size of cauldrons, blackened with soot and grease. She fetched endless buckets of water, polished boots, cleaned fireplaces, and did all the jobs so dreadful no one else wanted to touch them. For her trouble, she earned the lowest wages, endured the longest hours, and often collapsed into bed long after everyone else had gone to sleep. If the mansion was a body, the scullery maid was its overworked liver, indispensable, underappreciated, and constantly soaked in filth. This system wasn't just about efficiency, it was about maintaining order, making sure every servant knew their place as clearly as a chess piece knows its square. The strict hierarchy kept the household functioning, but it also ensured no one got ideas above their station. A footman couldn't question the cook, a maid couldn't cross the housekeeper, and heaven help the scullery girl who thought she could act like a parlour maid. Every role was locked in place like gears in a clock, each one turning to keep the grand facade of wealth running smoothly. For the masters upstairs, all of this was invisible. They saw gleaming silver, perfectly cooked roasts, and their guests marveling at the beauty of the dining room. What they didn't see was the army of human beings working in a delicate balance of status and subordination. The irony was clear. The people tasked with dusting the chandeliers lived in rooms barely lit by a candle. The ones who ironed fine gowns wore patched aprons, and the ones who created luxury for others often lived lives that were anything but luxurious. The great hierarchy of dusting wasn't just about cleaning, it was about control, about creating an invisible chain of command that mirrored the class system of Victorian England itself. Everyone had a place, and that place came with its own rules, privileges, and humiliations. For some, it was a ladder to climb, inch by inch. For most, it was a reminder that in the grand house of life, you were not upstairs, you were firmly, permanently downstairs. If Victorian servants were the gears in the household machine, the butler was the polished gear at the centre that made sure everything turned without squeaking. His title alone carried weight. The butler wasn't just some guy in a suit pouring drinks. It was the man who embodied order, propriety, and the delicate art of ensuring that the family appeared far more dignified than it really was. Think CEO of wine bottles and passive-aggressive sighs, and you're on the right track. The butler's most sacred duty was the wine cellar. This wasn't just a pantry with bottles, it was a treasure vault that could make or break reputations. A Victorian gentleman prided himself on offering guests a perfectly aged claret or a fortified sherry that didn't taste like vinegar. It fell to the butler to keep track of every bottle, every cork, and every vintage. If a guest wrinkled their nose at the port, it wasn't the master who felt the shame, it was the butler who carried the silent blame. A skilled butler knew his vintages like a priest knew scripture. He could uncork, decant, and serve with the precision of a surgeon, though with slightly fewer fatalities. But his role went far beyond alcohol. The butler was the keeper of the household keys, literally. Those jangling keys on his belt didn't just open doors, they represented his authority. Storerooms, wine cellars, pantries. If it was locked, the butler controlled it. And in a world where theft by desperate servants wasn't unheard of, the keys gave him both power and responsibility. He was trusted by the master with valuables, which meant everyone else had to bow to his silent, ever-present oversight. The butler wasn't just managing things, he was managing trust. Then there was the matter of staff management. The butler wasn't barking orders in the kitchen, that was the cook's territory. Nor was he organizing laundry, that was the housekeeper's realm. Instead, he was the face of discipline, the steady hand that ensured the household didn't collapse into chaos. A late footman, a sloppy parlour maid, the butler noticed. He wasn't usually the one who scolded or punished, but his word carried to the master, and his raised eyebrow could ruin a career. Many a servant learned to fear the butler's polite cough more than the cook's shouted curses. And then, of course, there were the dinners. The Victorian dinner party. The ultimate test of a butler's mettle. Imagine juggling 10 courses, dozens of guests, and footmen moving in perfect synchronization. It was less a meal and more a military campaign disguised with soup and pheasant. The butler had to oversee every detail. The correct wine with the correct course, the correct silverware in the correct order, the correct posture for his staff while serving. If a single fork was out of place, he would silently implode, while still keeping a face so neutral it could be carved in marble. Guests often left praising the master's wonderful hospitality, blissfully unaware that it was the butler's unflinching orchestration that kept the evening from collapsing into spilled gravy and social disaster. What made the butler particularly fascinating was his strange social position. Among servants, he was untouchable. He outranked everyone except the housekeeper, and even then their spheres of influence rarely collided. He dined separately, often at the head of the servants' table, and he carried himself with a dignity that blurred the line between servant and gentleman. Some butlers were so skilled and composed that guests occasionally mistook them for visiting professionals rather than staff. And unlike the scullery maid, whose wages barely bought bread, the butler could earn a comfortable salary, sometimes with generous tips and bonuses from appreciative masters. Yet, despite his elevated status, he was still a servant. His life was one of constant readiness, endless composure, and perpetual responsibility. If the family traveled, he went with them, ensuring the silver and wine arrived safely. If the master threw a tantrum about the wrong cufflinks, the butler absorbed the storm with calm apologies. He was expected to be unflappable, even saintly. Anger was beneath him, visible emotion unprofessional. In many ways, the butler lived in a kind of emotional straitjacket, forever polite, forever calm, forever ready to say, "Yes, sir," with a dignity that belied the grinding exhaustion underneath. It wasn't all wine and etiquette, though. Butlers often became repositories of secrets. They overheard quarrels, financial troubles, affairs, and family scandals. While maids might gossip, a butler was expected to be a vault. His discretion was his greatest asset, and many held on to family skeletons that could have filled entire graveyards. Some used this knowledge quietly to their advantage. Others bore it as yet another burden. In either case, the butler's silence was worth its weight in gold, or at least in vintage port. Butlers also had to navigate the odd expectations of appearance. A butler wasn't meant to be handsome like a footman. Instead, he needed presence, tall, dignified, commanding, with sideburns thick enough to convey stability. His uniform was immaculate, his gloves spotless, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He wasn't meant to dazzle, but to project unwavering authority, like a human metronome keeping the entire household in time. The phrase "the butler did it" may have become a murder mystery cliché, but in a sense it was true. If something got done, chances are the butler had his hand in it. He didn't cook the meal, but he ensured it was served. He didn't light the fire, but he checked that it burned at the right moment. He didn't pay the bills, but he knew exactly where the money went. The butler's fingerprints were everywhere, even if he never left a trace. In the end, the butler was both servant and symbol. To the family, he represented smooth efficiency. To the servants, he embodied authority. To himself, he was a man balancing on a razor-thin line between dignity and servitude. And while his masters basked in the glow of luxury, the butler stood in the shadows, running everything, controlling everything, yet owning nothing. If the butler was the face of authority in a Victorian household, the housekeeper was its iron backbone. She wasn't merely another servant. She was the undisputed monarch of the female staff, the wielder of keys, the guardian of linens, and the unchallenged master of knowing exactly what everyone was doing at any given moment. The mistress of the house might technically have been her superior, but in practice, many households quietly admitted the truth. The real queen wore no crown but carried a massive ring of keys. She knew every secret: who broke a vase, who broke their virtue. The housekeeper's power started with the keys. They clanked and jangled from her waist like the chains of command themselves. a noisy reminder that she alone controlled the linens, storerooms, and sometimes even the family's prized china. While the butler's keys opened wine cellars and silver cupboards, hers guarded the everyday essentials that kept the household alive. Need more sheets for the guest rooms? You had to go through her. Hoping for extra soap in the laundry? Ask nicely, and maybe she'd allow it. For a servant, she was both gatekeeper and supplier, which meant your life was smoother if you stayed in her good graces. Managing the female staff was a full-time occupation in itself. Parlour maids, chambermaids, laundry maids, kitchen maids, all of them reported to her. If a bed wasn't turned down properly, the housekeeper knew. If dust dared settle on a chandelier, she noticed. If a maid rolled her eyes when ordered to scrub the floor, the housekeeper caught it and stored that little detail away for later. Her authority didn't come from shouting, but from the silent, omnipresent knowledge that she saw everything. One glance from her, and maids scurried like mice under the glare of a cat. The position also demanded a curious balance of dignity and distance. Unlike most servants, the housekeeper often had her own private room, a modest but respectable sanctuary where she kept her accounts, planned schedules, and occasionally enjoyed a quiet cup of tea. For lower-ranking maids who slept in cramped attic rooms, this private space made her seem almost untouchably powerful. She wasn't one of them, but she wasn't one of the family either. She occupied an in-between world, more elevated than her staff, but forever below the mistress. Housekeepers also had to be financial managers. They controlled the household supplies, tracked laundry and linen inventories, and often kept the accounts for food, soap, candles, and all the mundane items that made a mansion appear effortlessly pristine. This meant she had to be trusted with money, a rare thing in a world where most servants handled nothing more valuable than a mop. A dishonest housekeeper could skim supplies, inflate costs, or quietly run her own side business out of the storeroom. Many didn't, of course, but the potential was always there, and if you wanted to imagine a Victorian crime thriller, you'd do well to start with a housekeeper who knew exactly how many pounds of sugar were missing. Her influence extended into the social sphere as well. She was the keeper of gossip, the holder of confidences, and the walking archive of the household's history. She knew which maid was sweet on which footman, which daughter of the family had flirted with disaster, and which visiting guest had too much to drink at last year's Christmas dinner. But unlike kitchen gossip, her knowledge was wielded with strategy. She didn't tattle idly. She used her understanding to keep order. If she hinted to a maid that she knew, it was often enough to correct behavior without ever needing to say more. For many young women, the housekeeper was both a terror and a role model. She embodied the promise that with enough hard work, skill, and ruthless self-control, a girl might climb from lowly maid to a position of genuine authority. She was proof that service wasn't always a dead end, but she was also the stark reminder that such power came at a price, a lifetime of work, celibacy more often than not, and the constant vigilance of someone who could never afford to let her guard down. Romance and scandal might have been part of her staff's lives, but for the housekeeper, such things were liabilities. Her marriage prospects were slim, not least because leaving her position meant giving up both her power and her modest comforts. And then there was her relationship with the mistress of the house. This delicate dance was one of the most fascinating aspects of Victorian service. The mistress relied on her housekeeper to keep everything running, but also needed to maintain her own authority. A clever housekeeper made sure her mistress felt in charge, while quietly ensuring she herself had the final say in most practical matters. If the mistress wanted to host a ball, the housekeeper turned that vague whim into an actual event, orchestrating everything from clean linens for the guest rooms to the correct placement of candles in the ballroom. It was a performance of deference masking an extraordinary degree of competence. Servants sometimes whispered that the housekeeper was scarier than the family itself. After all, the family might dismiss you, but the housekeeper could make your life miserable long before it came to that. She could assign the worst chores, dock privileges, and ensure that your name was mentioned with just the right tone when references were requested. In many ways, her authority was more immediate, more tangible, and far more personal than that of the lofty master upstairs. The housekeeper's role shows just how complex the servant world really was. It wasn't simply masters and servants. It was a web of hierarchies, loyalties, and authority figures, with the housekeeper positioned like a spider at the center, patient, calculating, and always aware of every vibration in her web. To the family, she represented competence and discretion. To her staff, she represented discipline and control. And to herself, she may have represented survival. A life of labor, yes, but also one of respect, stability, and the quiet satisfaction of being indispensable. In the end, the housekeeper was more than just another servant. She was the axis around which the entire female staff revolved. The queen who never wore a crown, the enforcer who never raised her voice, and the guardian of 1,000 secrets no one else was meant to know. In the grand theatre of Victorian households, she was the stage manager, the prompter, and sometimes the judge, all rolled into one. If the butler was the stern CEO and the housekeeper the iron-fisted queen, then the footmen were the pretty window dressing, the human wallpaper chosen not for what they could do, but for how they looked while doing it. The job description was simple: be tall, be handsome, and be able to stand still for hours without screaming internally. They were ornaments in livery, as much a part of the decor as the chandeliers they polished or the carpets they walked upon. Yet somehow they also carried the peculiar burden of representing a family's status. Why? Because in Victorian England, appearances mattered more than practicality. A wealthy household measured its success not by how efficiently the servants worked behind the scenes, but by how impressive it looked to outsiders. Enter the footman, the shining uniformed proof that the family had money to burn on good-looking young men who didn't actually do much. Hiring one footman showed wealth. Hiring two or more was a flex. Having an entire squad of them in gleaming uniforms, that was social warfare. The recruitment process for footmen bordered on absurd. Skills in cleaning, serving, or managing didn't matter nearly as much as looks. Household manuals at the time literally suggested hiring footmen who were tall, broad-shouldered, and this is real, well-formed in the legs. The legs mattered because footmen wore breeches that showcased their calves, and apparently Victorian high society was obsessed with well-sculpted ankles. If you had bad posture or weak ankles, your chances of employment were slimmer than the family's dining room knives. Once hired, the footman's life revolved around ritualized visibility. He answered doors, served at table, carried trays, and attended his master during carriage rides. Yet these tasks weren't really about efficiency. They were performances. When a guest entered a mansion, the sight of a tall uniformed footman opening the door was meant to impress them more than the actual comfort of being welcomed. At meals, footmen didn't simply pass dishes. They moved like choreographed dancers, placing plates with precision and retreating silently, as though gravity didn't affect them. Their silence was part of the spectacle, a reminder that the household had enough wealth to choreograph beauty into even the act of serving peas. The uniform was as much a job requirement as the job itself. Livery for footmen was often elaborate: tailcoats with shiny buttons, breeches, stockings, and powdered wigs in earlier decades. Those gleaming buttons, they weren't just decoration, they were status symbols, polished until they practically blinded guests at the dining table. Each family's livery had its own colors and style, which meant footmen doubled as walking billboards for the house's prestige. If you ever wondered what it was like to be a fashion accessory disguised as an employee, footmen could tell you if they were allowed to talk, which they usually weren't. For all their glamour, the job was far from ideal. Footmen were expected to stand still for long periods, often in drafty halls or freezing doorways, maintaining perfect posture even when their legs screamed for mercy. They had to be silent, discreet, and endlessly deferential, which meant the mental toll of suppression was as heavy as the physical one. Imagine being hired for your looks and then told to act invisible except when your body was needed for decoration. That was a footman's life, a living paradox of being hyper-visible but socially invisible. The family might show them off like prized greyhounds, but when it came to respect, footmen occupied a strange, precarious place in the servant hierarchy. They were technically under the authority of the butler, who directed their duties, and below the housekeeper in household importance. However, their proximity to the family gave them a veneer of glamour that other servants lacked. Guests noticed them. Mistresses occasionally flirted with them. Gossip sometimes swirled around their interactions. This made them both envied and ridiculed by their fellow staff, who saw their decorative role as little more than preening for pennies. Speaking of pennies, their pay wasn't great. Yes, they might earn slightly more than a maid thanks to tips from guests, but their wages didn't reflect the prestige their presence supposedly brought to the household. Worse, their career prospects were limited. Once your looks faded, or your ankles gave up, you were disposable. Unlike cooks or housekeepers, whose skills could carry them through middle age, footmen risked being cast aside once they no longer looked good in livery. There were plenty of young men eager to take their place, and Victorian households had no qualms about swapping one tall, handsome ornament for another. Footmen also carried the strange burden of double standards. On one hand, they were highly visible to guests, and were sometimes treated with a hint of admiration. On the other, they were mocked for being frivolous, accused of vanity, laziness, or even effeminacy, because their jobs emphasized appearance over grit. They were simultaneously objects of desire and subjects of ridicule, caught in a limbo where everyone noticed them but no one took them seriously. Yet for all the discomfort, many young men pursued footman positions. Why? Because in a world of grinding factory work and back-breaking manual labor, being paid however little to stand in a warm house, look good, and occasionally carry a tray wasn't the worst fate. It offered food, shelter, and a chance, however slim, to climb up into higher positions like under butler or valet, if luck and connections aligned. Some even managed to charm their way into marriages with maids or widows who could pull them out of service altogether. For a working-class boy with few options, being a human accessory was still better than starving. In the grand theatre of Victorian mansions, footmen were the chorus line. They didn't write the script, they didn't lead the action, but they were always on stage, perfectly posed, perfectly silent, and perfectly replaceable. Their presence said more about the vanity of the family than the usefulness of the servant. And while they might have looked splendid in their uniforms, behind the polished buttons and well-shaped calves lay the quiet knowledge that they were as disposable as the candles they lit. If the butler managed dignity and the footman posed for decoration, then the cook ruled fire and fury. The Victorian kitchen was less culinary heaven and more smoky battlefield, and the cook was its general, its tyrant, and sometimes its most long-suffering casualty. Her job? Running the kitchen, feeding dozens daily, and doing so without collapsing face-first into a boiling pot of stew. No pressure, just cook a 12-course meal with coal stoves and knives sharper than your pay raise prospects. The sheer scale of the work is what made the cook's role so extraordinary. This wasn't a cozy little family dinner we're talking about. It was a Victorian household, where hosting was practically a blood sport. Dinner wasn't a plate of meat and potatoes. It was a parade of courses, each more elaborate than the last, carefully timed and executed to impress guests. A large mansion might demand soups, fish, roasts, game, puddings, jellies and pastries, each with its own garnishes, sauces and precise presentation, and all of this had to arrive piping hot, at the exact right moment, in the exact order dictated by culinary tradition and social snobbery. One late dish, and the entire meal was deemed a failure. Even if you'd just spent 12 hours fighting a coal stove like it was a dragon, the cook's authority came from her command over this chaos. While technically she was a servant, she wielded power that rivaled the butler's. The kitchen was her kingdom, and stepping into it without her permission was a dangerous move. Even the mistress of the house often deferred to her expertise when it came to menus. After all, it was one thing to suggest something light but elegant for the luncheon. It was another to actually create it when your only tools were a fire that refused to stay steady and an oven that could scorch a pie faster than you could blink. Her relationship with the kitchen maids and scullery girls was that of commander to troops. She shouted orders across smoky rooms, expected absolute obedience, and wielded a wooden spoon with the authority of a scepter. Young maids trembled under her gaze, knowing that one burnt sauce could unleash a tirade that would echo across the stone walls. Yet as terrifying as she could be, she was also the one who taught them, sometimes harshly, sometimes grudgingly, how to master the art of chopping, seasoning, and not setting the drapes on fire. Coal was the bane of every cook's existence. Unlike modern gas or electric ranges, coal stoves had a temperament, too much coal, and the heat roared uncontrollably, incinerating delicate dishes. Too little, and your roast goose was reduced to lukewarm misery. The cook had to constantly monitor the flames, adjust vents, and pray to the gods of fire that the heat held steady. Add to that the perpetual smoke, soot and ash that coated every surface, and you begin to understand why cooks often emerged from the kitchen looking like they'd fought a small chimney fire. Then there were the knives, cleavers, and spits, tools that doubled as weapons in the daily war against raw ingredients. Victorian recipes were not forgiving. Dishes required precision, timing, and a certain willingness to manhandle sides of beef that weighed as much as a small child. A cook had to know how to butcher, boil, roast, and bake, often all at once, and unlike modern celebrity chefs, no one applauded when she pulled it off. At best, the family upstairs ate in silence, occasionally nodding their approval. At worst, a guest sniffed and declared the fish slightly overdone, erasing an entire day's labor with a single sentence. Despite the misery, cooks could wield surprising power in the household hierarchy. Skilled cooks were in demand, and a wealthy family could not easily replace one without risking social humiliation at their dinner parties. This gave experienced cooks leverage that few servants enjoyed. While a footman might be replaced in a week, a talented cook could negotiate higher wages, better quarters, or simply more respect. In rare cases, cooks became minor celebrities in their own right, known by name to the families they served, and occasionally courted by other households eager to lure them away. But for every powerful cook, there were dozens who lived exhausting, underpaid lives. Their hours stretched from dawn when bread had to be baked, to late at night when suppers and late snacks were finally finished. They endured burns, cuts, smoke inhalation, and the endless ache of standing on stone floors. Their reward? Modest wages, the occasional leftover dish, and the dubious satisfaction of knowing that upstairs someone was enjoying a perfect soufflé thanks to their labor. Cooks also played a role in shaping the culture of the house. The meals they created defined the household's reputation. A family known for extravagant dinners earned social clout. A family with lackluster meals faced whispers. In this way, the cook influenced status in a way that no butler or housekeeper could. She didn't just feed stomachs, she fed reputations. And all the while, she remained out of sight, her artistry hidden behind the kitchen door, her name unmentioned at the dining table. And yet, for all the frustrations, some cooks took pride in their work. They relished the challenge of producing elaborate dishes under impossible conditions. They perfected recipes, innovated within the constraints of coal and limited ingredients, and left behind the culinary traditions that still echo today. Their jellies, puddings, and roasts were more than food. They were symbols of a household's wealth and a culture's obsession with spectacle. The cook's kingdom was hot, smoky, and often miserable, but it was also a throne of sorts. She ruled it with authority, discipline, and sheer endurance. In the labyrinth of Victorian service, she was both tyrant and artist, producing feasts that others claimed credit for, but that bore her unseen fingerprints on every plate. And while her knives were meant for carving roasts, they might as well have been for carving out her place in a world that seldom gave women power of any kind. If the Victorian household was a ladder, the scullery maid wasn't even standing on the first rung. She was clinging desperately to the bottom, getting her fingers stepped on by everyone above. Congratulations, you're the bottom rung of a ladder that leads to nowhere. Among all the servants who toiled in those cavernous mansions, the scullery maid had the most thankless, soul-grinding, back-breaking job of them all. She wasn't just a worker, she was the human mop, sponge and dishwasher rolled into one, paid less than anyone else, and usually treated with about the same level of respect as a half-broken bucket. Her main duty? Scrubbing. Endless scrubbing. Mountains of greasy pots and pans towered around her like metallic cliffs. These weren't your lightweight modern skillets. They were cast-iron beasts, sometimes big enough to roast entire animals, blackened with soot and stubborn with grease. Each one had to be scrubbed until it gleamed, using sand, brick dust, or harsh soaps that cracked skin faster than gossip spread through the servants' hall. By the end of the day, her hands were raw, her arms aching, and her back screaming for mercy. If dishwashing today is a chore, imagine doing it for 14 hours straight, with no rubber gloves, no running hot water, and 0 dishwasher cycles to save you. And speaking of water, fetching it was another of her daily tortures. Victorian houses didn't always have convenient plumbing, so water had to be hauled by hand from pumps, wells, or cisterns, buckets of it, over and over again. For washing dishes, for boiling clothes, for scrubbing floors, for filling the massive copper kettles that seemed to exist solely to mock her. Each bucket was heavy enough to strain muscles she didn't even know she had. Spill a drop on the way? Too bad. Go fetch another. Her day was a never-ending marathon of bucket lugging, one that made her arms strong enough to out-wrestle a farmhand, but left her too exhausted to enjoy any supposed free time. The kitchen floor was her personal battlefield. It had to be scrubbed daily, sometimes multiple times, because kitchens weren't just messy, they were war zones of spilt gravy, flour clouds, coal dust, and grease explosions. And the scullery maid was the first line of defense. On her knees with a brush and bucket, she scraped and scrubbed until the flagstones shone, only to see them dirtied again minutes later when the cook or kitchen maids tromped back in with dripping ladles and half-burnt pans. It was the Sisyphean task of Victorian service. The floor was never truly clean, only temporarily less disgusting. Her hours were brutal. While other servants might rise early, the scullery maid rose earlier. Before dawn she was up, lighting fires, boiling water, and preparing the kitchen for the cook's arrival. While others retired late, she stayed up later, scrubbing the last pots and pans after the household's final meal was done. Sleep was a rumor she sometimes heard about but rarely experienced. The scullery maid's day could stretch to 18 hours, leaving her just enough time to collapse into bed in the tiny damp corner she called a bedroom, before repeating it all again. Her wages reflected her status. Pitiful. Paid less than almost anyone else in the house. Her salary barely bought clothes that weren't already worn to rags. Food wasn't much of a perk either. While the family dined on lavish meals and even the cook sampled delicacies, the scullery maid often survived on scraps, burnt crusts, leftover porridge, or whatever could be scavenged without the cook noticing. Malnutrition was a constant shadow, made worse by the sheer physical exertion of her work. It was like running a marathon every day, fueled only by crumbs. Socially, she was the invisible servant. Other staff sometimes pitied her, sometimes ignored her, and occasionally looked down on her despite being servants themselves. A parlour maid might brag about polishing silver in the dining room, but no one ever bragged about scraping grease off roasting pans. She rarely saw the family upstairs, except perhaps when carrying water to the laundry or scurrying out of sight in the hallways. To the masters, she was practically non-existent, a ghost in a uniform who kept their world running without them ever realizing it. For young girls from poor families, however, the scullery maid role was often the only way into service. Many began their careers in this position, some as young as 12 or 13, dragged from the countryside or city slums into households that needed cheap, tireless labor. For these girls, hope came in the faint possibility of promotion. If they survived long enough, kept their heads down, and avoided collapsing from exhaustion, they might one day be noticed and moved up to a slightly better position, like kitchen maid. But the climb was slow and uncertain, and for many the scullery was their permanent lot. The work also took its toll physically. Constant exposure to steam, smoke, and damp conditions meant chronic coughs and respiratory problems were common. Kneeling for hours on cold stone floors left joints aching and swollen. Cuts, burns, and blisters decorated their hands like grim badges of honor. And because medical care was expensive and often useless, most ailments were treated with nothing more than rags, vinegar, or sheer stubbornness. And yet, for all the misery, the scullery maid's work was indispensable. Without her, the kitchen couldn't function. The cook couldn't create elaborate dishes if the pans were caked with yesterday's grease. The maids couldn't do their jobs without the endless buckets of water she provided. She was the foundation of the foundation, the unsung laborer, whose absence would bring the whole delicate system crashing down. The irony, of course, was that the more essential she was, the less she was valued. If the Victorian mansion was a glittering stage, the scullery maid wasn't even in the cast list. She was the one sweeping the floorboards long after the curtain had dropped. She lived at the bottom of the hierarchy, endured the harshest tasks, and carried the least recognition. And yet, without her, the great machine of service would grind to a halt, a fact no one cared to admit. For her, every day was a cycle of drudgery, exhaustion, and invisibility, a reminder that in the grand scheme of Victorian life, some people were destined to scrub while others dined. If the life of a Victorian servant could be summed up in one phrase, it would be long, longer, longest. A day in service wasn't a tidy 9 to 5. It was a relentless cycle that began before dawn and ended only when exhaustion pinned you to your straw-stuffed mattress. Breakfast for you, cold tea. Breakfast for them, 6 kinds of eggs and a pheasant. The imbalance wasn't just culinary, it was stitched into every waking moment of your day. Servants rose hours before their masters stirred. The first sound wasn't birdsong or an alarm clock. It was the clang of the kitchen bell or the bark of the housekeeper reminding everyone that the day had started. Whether you liked it or not, the scullery maid, the lowest on the ladder, was usually the first to rise, fumbling in the dark to light the kitchen fire. Without her work, no one else could function. The cook needed heat to begin preparing bread and broth. The maids needed hot water for cleaning, and the entire household needed the illusion of a smooth morning. By the time the family upstairs opened their eyes, a small army had already been working for hours. Morning tasks fell into a rhythm as predictable as it was punishing. Parlour maids hurried to sweep fireplaces, lay fresh coals and polish grates so that when the family wandered in later, the hearth appeared to have magically maintained itself. Chambermaids rushed up to bedrooms hauling jugs of hot water, airing out beds, and discreetly removing chamber pots that no one liked to mention but everyone relied on. Footmen donned immaculate uniforms to prepare for breakfast service, rehearsing their movements like stage actors awaiting their cues. Even the butler was up, ensuring the dining room gleamed, the silver shone, and the keys jingled with reassuring authority. And then came the dreaded breakfast shift. For the servants, a hurried gulp of lukewarm tea or yesterday's crust was all there was time for. But for the masters, breakfast was an event. Dishes of bacon, ham, sausages, kidneys, toast, and multiple varieties of eggs graced the table. In wealthier households, pheasant or cold game might also make an appearance, because nothing said morning quite like a bird that once roamed the estate. Servants not only cooked and served these lavish spreads but also cleaned up the wreckage afterward, scrubbing dishes while already preparing for the next round of meals. Once breakfast was over, the mid-morning rush began. Bedrooms had to be dusted, polished and tidied, hallways swept and scrubbed, carpets beaten free of soot, brass and silver polished until they reflected your face like a cruel mirror of your fatigue. Laundry mounds of it had to be boiled, scrubbed and wrung out, with sheets hung in any patch of sun that dared break through the English clouds. Meanwhile, the cook was already knee-deep in preparations for luncheon, which meant the kitchen staff worked in a haze of steam and shouted orders. Luncheon for the family came around 1 or 2 o'clock. For the servants, it came whenever they could snatch a bite of bread, usually standing up in the kitchen, hoping the cook wasn't watching. The meal itself might include cold meats, jellies, pies, and salads. Simple for the family, back-breaking for the kitchen staff who had been chopping, slicing, and boiling since morning. Once the plates were cleared, the cleaning resumed, because in a Victorian household, the word finished didn't really exist. Afternoons were a blur of endless small tasks. Windows were polished, boots were shined, and errands were run. Servants darted in and out of rooms, often unnoticed, ensuring that fires stayed stoked and candles trimmed. If guests arrived, the footmen and parlour maids shifted into performance mode, orchestrating tea service with delicate cups and trays. For the family, it was leisure. For the staff, it was choreography. Dinner, however, was the Everest of the servants' day. It demanded preparation on a scale that defied reason. By evening, the kitchen was a battlefield of roasting meats, simmering soups, boiling sauces, and sweating maids dodging the cook's temper. Footmen rehearsed their movements in the dining room, polishing glasses until they gleamed. The butler hovered, checking wine pairings, while the housekeeper ensured the linen was flawless. Dinner itself could stretch for hours, course after elaborate course parading out of the kitchen and onto the gleaming table. For the servants, the stress was monumental. One wrong move, one dropped dish, and reputations could shatter faster than porcelain plates. When the family finally pushed back their chairs and retired to parlours or drawing rooms, the servants' work wasn't over. It had only shifted. Fires needed tending in the family's rooms. Leftovers had to be cleared and stored. Plates, pots, and pans were once again scrubbed into submission. Laundry from the day was hauled, sorted, and soaked. And if guests stayed late into the night, footmen stood stiffly at attention, waiting to open doors, fetch cloaks, and extinguish lamps. By the time the mansion went quiet, the servants staggered into their quarters. Their end of day was less a moment of relaxation, and more a collapse. They might share stories, laughter, or whispered gossip in the servants' hall, but fatigue usually won. Their beds were narrow, their rest brief, because just a few hours later the scullery maid would be rising again, fumbling with firewood in the dark, and the cycle would begin anew. A Victorian servant's daily schedule was relentless, repetitive, and merciless. It was a life dictated by bells, by the whims of the household, and by the constant need to maintain a facade of effortless elegance upstairs. Downstairs there was no elegance, just aching feet, tired eyes, and the endless knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly the same. It was the grind before the grind was fashionable, the original 9-to-eternity job. And the only real break? Sleep so deep you didn't dream, because even your subconscious was too exhausted to show up. If Victorian service life had a soundtrack, it wouldn't be polite chamber music wafting through the halls. It would be the constant nerve-jangling clang of servant bells echoing like the world's worst alarm clock. Imagine living in a house where your every movement was dictated by a piece of wire and a little metal clapper. Welcome to the infamous servant bell system, a game of musical chairs, except if you lose, you're fired. The bell system was a marvel of Victorian engineering and a nightmare for everyone forced to obey it. Each important room in the mansion, dining room, bedrooms, parlours, dressing rooms, was fitted with a pull cord or button. A guest lifted a finger, tugged a tassel, or later pressed an early electric buzzer, and somewhere below stairs a bell clanged to life. Every bell was connected by wires running through walls, winding into the servants' quarters, where they were mounted in neat rows on a bell board. Each bell was labelled so the staff knew exactly which room had made the call. In theory, it was efficient. In practice, it was controlled chaos. Picture it, you're polishing silver or hauling laundry when suddenly clang, clang, clang. The bell for the drawing room is ringing like it's summoning you to judgment. Drop what you're doing, race upstairs and arrive breathless, only to discover that the mistress wanted the window cracked open 2 inches. Before you can even descend again, clang! This time it's the dining room, demanding more coal for the fire. Bells weren't just requests, they were commands, and ignoring them wasn't an option unless you enjoyed unemployment. The real torment was when multiple bells rang at once. Servants described the system as a kind of mechanical chorus, each clang demanding immediate attention. Footmen and maids dashed through hallways like panicked squirrels, trying to be first to answer the right bell. The unwritten rule was simple. Whoever arrived last earned a glare, a scolding, or worse, a black mark on their record. One housemaid later recalled that the bells created more running than a pack of foxhounds. Of course, the masters upstairs never considered what this constant jangling meant. For them, the bell was freedom, the ability to summon hot tea, fresh candles, or assistance dressing without moving more than a wrist. For the servants, it was servitude in pure auditory form. The bell didn't care if you were already overloaded, if your back ached, or if you hadn't eaten since dawn. It demanded obedience immediately. In that way, the bells were less about efficiency and more about control. Some systems grew increasingly elaborate. Wealthy households installed indicator boards where each bell was attached to a small pendulum or flap that showed which room was calling. Even if the bell had stopped ringing, the sight of a row of pendulums swinging like judgmental metronomes was enough to strike terror into the heart of any servant. Later, as technology advanced, some homes even installed electric buzzers. Instead of clanging bells, you now had a sharp, insistent buzz that made your teeth itch. Progress, it turned out, was just a new way to be annoyed. The bell system also exposed the strange priorities of Victorian households. Some rooms had multiple pulls, one near the bed, another near the fireplace, even one by the bathtub, because heaven forbid the master of the house have to walk more than 3 steps to request a servant. Guests quickly picked up on the system, often pulling for minor whims. A bit more coal, another cushion, some fresh flowers. Every whim translated into another frantic race downstairs. Servants often joked bitterly that the only thing missing was a bell that rang every time the master blinked. Butlers and housekeepers had their own fraught relationship with the bells. For them, the noise wasn't just irritating, it was a test of discipline. They had to ensure that someone responded promptly no matter the hour. If a bell rang at midnight, a footman or maid was dispatched. If it rang during dinner service, someone slipped away discreetly. The butler didn't always answer the bells himself, but he bore the responsibility of making sure no call went unanswered. In this way, the bells were like a leash attached not just to the lowest maid, but to the entire chain of command. The psychological toll was real. Servants spoke of living in a constant state of hyper-awareness, ears tuned to every clang. Even when the bells weren't ringing, they haunted the servants' imagination. Some confessed to phantom bells, hearing the clang when none had rung, a Victorian version of the cell phone phantom buzz we know today. The sound was so tied to stress that even long after leaving service, former maids remembered it as the defining noise of their youth. Ironically, the bell system often created inefficiencies. Because it made summoning servants so easy, masters called for things they could have managed themselves. A dropped handkerchief, a candle slightly tilted, a curtain needing adjustment. Tasks that could have been solved with one lazy stretch were transformed into another sprint for the servants. In that way, the system encouraged dependency. Upstairs, it reinforced the idea that labor was invisible and instantly available. Downstairs, it reminded servants that their lives weren't their own. They were at the mercy of wires in the wall. And then there was the ever-present humiliation. No matter how hard you worked, the bell could undo it. You might have scrubbed floors for hours, polished boots until they gleamed, and folded linens into perfect squares. But if the master pulled a cord and you didn't appear quickly enough, all that effort was forgotten. You were reduced once more to nothing more than a body summoned by a clang. The bell system was the perfect metaphor for Victorian service. Technologically impressive, socially oppressive, and utterly exhausting, it reduced human beings to moving parts in a larger mechanism, each clang a reminder that your time, your energy, and your very presence belonged not to you but to the household. For the family upstairs, it was convenience. For the servants downstairs, it was panic. And when the bells rang at once, it was bedlam in bronze. In a Victorian mansion, a servant's uniform wasn't just clothing. It was a costume, a disguise, and a constant reminder that your life wasn't your own. Every stitch was designed to keep you in your place, every button a silent command to fade into the background. Your outfit said, "I'm here, but please pretend I'm not." The very walls of the house might have been decorated with gilded wallpaper and velvet curtains, but the servants were expected to be part of that decor too. animated furnishings that looked neat, spoke little, and moved only when summoned. The rules of dress varied depending on rank. At the top of the male hierarchy, the butler wore sober black or dark livery, usually with a waistcoat and sometimes tails, meant to signal dignity and restraint. He wasn't there to dazzle. He was there to project steady authority like a walking grandfather clock in human form. Footmen, on the other hand, were designed for spectacle. Their livery was brightly coloured, often in the family's chosen hues, trimmed with gleaming brass or silver buttons, and tailored to show off their height and posture. Guests didn't just admire the furnishings of the house, they admired the handsome young men who matched the drapes. It was wealth on two legs. Female servants had their own strict codes. Parlour maids and chambermaids wore simple dark dresses, usually black or brown, with stiff white aprons and caps. These weren't fashionable garments, they were uniforms designed to erase individuality. A maid in her uniform wasn't Mary or Sarah, she was the maid. The caps in particular acted as a kind of visual shorthand. A crisp, clean cap signaled order and respectability, while a rumpled one suggested laziness or incompetence. Heaven help the maid who appeared before the mistress with a crooked bow or a stained apron. The cook and housekeeper had slightly more leeway. The housekeeper often wore darker, more formal gowns with a bunch of keys at her waist, a badge of office as much as her clothing. The cook, cloaked in aprons and sleeves rolled up for battle, was allowed practicality over elegance. Still, even she had to look respectable, because appearances mattered. A cook spattered in grease might know her craft, but if she looked untidy when glimpsed by the mistress, whispers of slovenliness could begin. Uniforms weren't just about neatness, they were about invisibility. Servants were supposed to look tidy but not stylish, proper but not eye-catching. A servant who dressed too well might be accused of vanity, of aspiring to look like the people upstairs. For women especially, this line was razor thin. A maid might be scolded if her dress was too plain, reflecting badly on the household, yet punished if she added even the faintest trace of personal flair. Jewelry? Out of the question. A ribbon in the wrong colour? Grounds for a reprimand. It was an endless balancing act. Look polished, but never too polished. Footmen, of course, had the opposite problem. Their livery was deliberately flamboyant, but it wasn't for them, it was for the family's reputation. A tall, handsome footman in gleaming buttons and breeches was essentially a status symbol on legs. Guests might gasp at the splendour of the uniform, but the man wearing it often felt more like a mannequin than a person. He couldn't slouch, couldn't fidget, and couldn't speak unless addressed. His appearance was his job, and the livery was a reminder that he was, in essence, owned spectacle. One of the cruelties of these uniforms was their impracticality. Servants were expected to haul coal, scrub floors, polish silver, and carry heavy trays while wearing clothing that was stiff, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright absurd. Imagine scouring soot from a fireplace in a starched apron, or hauling water in shoes that pinched your toes. For the footman, tight breeches might have looked splendid to dinner guests, but running up and down stairs in them was agony. Servants were judged not by whether their clothes suited their tasks, but by whether their clothes pleased the eyes of the masters. Laundry was another layer of punishment. Servants didn't just wear uniforms, they had to keep them immaculate. Aprons had to be bleached, caps had to be crisp, coats had to be brushed daily, and since most households didn't have endless supplies of spare clothing, this meant the same garments were washed and worn over and over until they nearly disintegrated. The irony, servants often worked harder maintaining their uniforms than they did maintaining their own bodies. Cleanliness of appearance mattered more to the household than the health of the servant. The uniform also acted as a kind of leash in public. If a servant was sent to run errands, their clothing marked them instantly as staff. There was no blending in, no pretending to be part of polite society. The butcher, the grocer, and even passers-by on the street knew immediately who they worked for and where they fit in the social hierarchy. In this way, uniforms weren't just about the household, they broadcasted the family's wealth and the servant's submission to the wider world. And yet, for all their restrictions, uniforms could also foster a sense of solidarity. Servants recognized each other by dress, and in large households the uniform became part of one's identity. It was a strange badge of belonging, even if it also erased individuality. In the servants' hall, maids joked about caps, footmen compared buttons, and cooks grumbled about grease stains that refused to come out. Clothing might have been a tool of control, but it was also woven into the shared experience of service life. Ultimately, Victorian servant uniforms tell us everything about the paradox of service. They projected order while concealing the chaos behind the scenes. They made servants visible as symbols but invisible as people. They were practical enough to function but impractical enough to enforce suffering. And above all, they were reminders that in a world obsessed with appearances, even the people who made the luxury possible had to look like part of the furniture. In Victorian England, wealth wasn't just about owning fine things, it was about making sure those fine things gleamed like the sun itself. A dusty chandelier, a dull piece of silver, or a limp shirt collar could be a social catastrophe. And who ensured that the masters always sparkled, while the servants themselves looked like boiled potatoes? The servants dedicated to grooming the family's image, of course. An army of polishers, ironers, and brush wielders who spent their lives turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, only to remain invisible in the glow of their master's shine. Take silver, for instance. No object in a Victorian household was allowed to simply exist. It had to gleam with a brilliance that practically blinded the guests. Polishing silver wasn't just a job, it was a religion. Every fork, spoon, candlestick, and tray was scrubbed with gritty powders, elbow grease, and endless patience until the servant could see their own exhausted reflection staring back at them. If a guest picked up a spoon and saw even the faintest smudge, it wasn't the master's embarrassment, it was the servant's failure. One poor maid later confessed that she would dream of silver cutlery at night, marching toward her like an army demanding to be polished again. Clothing, too, was a battlefield. The master's shirts had to be crisp, spotless, and so heavily starched they could practically stand on their own. Starching shirts was no simple matter. It required boiling, ironing, and pressing until the collars could slice the air like blades. Gentlemen wore their shirts as symbols of control and refinement, but for the servants, producing them was an ordeal of burns, sweat, and constant vigilance. If a collar sagged, or worse, if it wilted during dinner, the master might frown, but it was the servant who paid the price for not turning fabric into armor. Shoes and boots were another obsession. Victorian streets were muddy, dusty, and filled with all manner of substances, best left undescribed, and yet no gentleman or lady could be seen wearing footwear that bore a trace of reality. Servants scrubbed, polished, and buffed leather until it gleamed like patent glass, layering polish with rags until they could practically shave in the reflection. Some households employed specific boot boys, whose sole purpose in life was to ensure that footwear achieved a shine that defied both weather and common sense. And remember, this work wasn't just once a week, it was every day. A gentleman might change boots multiple times depending on his activities, which meant someone below stairs was locked in an eternal duel with mud. Even the smallest details were part of this grooming ritual. Hat brims were brushed, gloves stretched, and handkerchiefs pressed to perfection. Ladies' gowns required brushing and mending after every wearing, with lace refluffed and silk carefully hung to avoid creases. Parasols had to be dusted, jewelry polished, and hairpieces arranged. The family didn't simply dress, they emerged from their chambers as curated exhibitions of wealth, their every thread, bead, and button preened to impress. Behind the curtain of this daily performance, servants sweated to maintain the illusion. It wasn't only about the things, though, it was about the masters themselves. Valets for the men and ladies' maids for the women managed their personal appearances with the same meticulous care. A valet wasn't just a servant, he was a personal stylist, grooming his master's hair, shaving his face, and ensuring his cravat tied into the perfect knot. A lady's maid brushed out her mistress's hair until it gleamed, applied cosmetics, and even laced corsets so tightly they could crack ribs. These attendants bore the responsibility for ensuring their employers looked flawless, while their own hair might be plastered down with water, and their hands red raw from soap. Their shine had to blind guests. Theirs? No one cared if they looked like a boiled potato. The irony of this obsession with appearances was that the labor behind it had to remain invisible. Guests weren't supposed to imagine that behind the glittering silver and crisp collars were hours of sweat, sore muscles, and singed fingers. A successful servant wasn't congratulated for their work. They were ignored, their labor erased by the illusion of effortless luxury. If anything, attention was only drawn to mistakes. A spot of tarnish, a wrinkle in a gown, a muddy smudge on a shoe. These were treated like crimes against the social order, punishable with scoldings, lost wages, or dismissal. The perfection of the master's image was the servant's burden, and any failure weighed heavily on the lowest rungs. And then there was the endless cycle of it all. Silver tarnished again, shirts grew dirty again, boots found mud again, nothing ever stayed finished. Servants were caught in a treadmill where every task had to be repeated day after day, week after week, without end. To polish, starch, and shine wasn't to complete a job, it was to reset the clock until the next demand. Unlike the masters who enjoyed the fruits of their appearance in public society, the servants had no end to the cycle, no applause for their artistry, just more laundry, more polish, and more aching hands. Yet within this grind was a strange kind of craftsmanship. A well-polished shoe or gleaming candlestick was, in its way, a piece of art. Servants developed techniques, perfected routines, and took pride in mastering the impossible. Some even competed quietly among themselves, striving to produce the brightest shine, the stiffest collar, the most immaculate gown. Pride was one of the few rewards available, and perhaps the only way to endure a life dedicated to keeping other people spotless while you yourself lived perpetually smudged. In the grand theatre of Victorian wealth, servants were the backstage crew, endlessly brushing, polishing, ironing, and buffing to make sure the stars dazzled under the lights. The irony, of course, is that the stars got the applause, while the crew remained unseen in the shadows. For every gentleman admired for his crisp shirt front or lady praised for her sparkling diamonds, there were exhausted servants below stairs who had stitched, pressed, and scrubbed until their knuckles bled. Without them, the performance collapsed, but with them the family glittered, while they themselves remained, as always, invisible. Victorian homes were monuments to excess, velvet drapes pooling on the floor, ornate plasterwork on ceilings, carved furniture with more nooks and crannies than sense. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also magnets for filth. Enter the chambermaids, housemaids, and laundrymaids, the invisible warriors in an endless battle against dirt, soot, and grime. Their enemy, dust, which in the Victorian age seemed to multiply like rabbits on honeymoon. And unlike rabbits, this dust didn't stop. It spread, settled, and mocked every effort to eradicate it. The problem began with coal. Every fire in the mansion, whether in the kitchen, the drawing room, or the bedrooms, spewed out soot and ash that floated through the house like malicious confetti. Add in oil lamps, smoky kitchens, and London's industrial air pollution, and you had a perfect recipe for a perpetual layer of grime. Dust settled on every surface, every cushion, every shelf. For the housemaids, life became one long attempt to keep the house presentable despite the universe itself working against them. Chambermaids bore the brunt of morning tasks. At the crack of dawn they scurried from room to room, armed with brushes, dusters, and cloths. Beds had to be stripped and remade, sheets shaken out, and fireplaces cleared of ash before being reset for the day. Curtains needed drawing. Chamber pots needed discreet removal. No one wanted to imagine those existed, and every flat surface begged to be wiped down. Chambermaids didn't just tidy rooms, they erased all evidence that people had lived in them, turning chaos back into order before the family awoke. Housemaids, meanwhile, were the infantry of the dust wars. Their battlefield was the hallways, staircases, and public rooms where guests might actually notice dirt. Carpets had to be swept daily, sometimes beaten outside with sticks until clouds of dust turned the air opaque. Rugs were rolled up, hauled outdoors, and pummeled until they looked respectable again. And then there were the endless brass fixtures, doorknobs, candlesticks, banisters, all of which demanded constant polishing to keep them gleaming. One housemaid famously remarked that she could see her reflection in a doorknob more often than in a mirror, and it never looked happy. The laundry maids fought their own grueling campaign, one that made modern laundry day grumbles look laughable. Washing clothes and linens meant hauling water, gallons and gallons of it, into giant copper tubs. Shirts, gowns, and sheets were boiled, scrubbed, and beaten against washboards until the fabric threatened to dissolve. Then came wringing, hanging, drying, starching, and ironing. Laundry was so exhausting that it often consumed entire days, yet it had to be done continuously. With the family changing outfits multiple times a day and servants needing their uniforms spotless, the laundry room was less a workplace and more a wet, steaming purgatory. And of course, just when the servants managed to clean everything, the family undid it. Children ran through the halls with sticky fingers, guests trailed mud across the carpets, and fires belched soot back onto freshly scrubbed mantles. The house itself seemed to conspire against cleanliness. A chambermaid could spend hours dusting a room, only to watch the sunlight reveal another constellation of particles drifting lazily down to land right where she'd just polished. It was like fighting a battle where the enemy regenerated instantly. The monotony was crushing. Cleaning wasn't just repetitive, it was Sisyphean. Every day the same tasks, the same rooms, the same dust. And because the work was invisible when done well, servants rarely received thanks. If a room sparkled, it was taken for granted. If a single smudge remained, it was noticed immediately. Praise was scarce, scoldings were plentiful. Housemaids learned to live in a world where success meant silence and failure meant humiliation. The tools of the trade were equally merciless: heavy rugs to beat, stiff brushes to scrub with, caustic soaps that ate into skin. Ironing required lifting heavy, fire-heated irons that scorched clothes and burned fingers. Chambermaids carried sloshing buckets of hot water up endless flights of stairs, leaving trails of blisters on their hands and sore muscles that never had time to heal. Dust cloths filled with soot were wrung out only to blacken hands anew. The war on dirt was not fought with shiny modern vacuums, but with brute force, sweat, and lungs full of coal dust. And yet within this constant struggle there was discipline, even artistry. Housemaids perfected their sweeping techniques, making their strokes precise and efficient. Laundry maids developed an instinct for when water was just the right temperature for boiling whites without destroying them. Chambermaids learned the choreography of moving silently through bedrooms, adjusting sheets and curtains so quickly that the family barely realized someone had been there. Their labor demanded skill, even if society never acknowledged it. For the family upstairs, a spotless home was a reflection of status. Cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it was about reputation. A guest who found dust on a mantel might whisper about the family's slackness, and that whisper could ripple through society. Thus, the servants below were trapped in a constant cycle of cleaning, not for comfort but for show. The gleam of a chandelier wasn't about lighting a room better, it was about demonstrating that the family had enough staff to keep it shining. The irony, of course, was that the very people making the home spotless often lived in quarters that were cramped, damp, and perpetually dirty. The maids who scrubbed floors upstairs slept on straw mattresses in drafty attics, surrounded by dust no one cared to banish. They polished mirrors for their masters but rarely had one of their own. They washed fine linens for the family, but wore patched garments themselves. They were guardians of luxury who never got to share in it. The endless war against dust wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Without it, the illusion of effortless wealth upstairs would crumble in a haze of soot and grime. Chambermaids, housemaids, and laundrymaids may have been invisible, but their work defined the household. Each gleaming brass knob, each crisp sheet, each spotless rug was a silent testament to their labor. They didn't win the war against dust. It always came back, but they fought it daily, bravely, and without recognition. In the great Victorian mansion, they were the forgotten soldiers of cleanliness, marching endlessly into battle with brushes, buckets, and broken backs. If Victorian houses had one thing in common, it was mountains of laundry. The grand image of a family changing their outfits 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a day, translated into a nightmare for the servants below stairs. And while clean linen and crisp shirts screamed respectability upstairs, downstairs they screamed something else entirely: exhaustion, steam, and aching arms. Nothing says luxury like your underwear being boiled by someone earning pennies. Laundry in a Victorian mansion wasn't a tidy weekly task. It was an industrial operation, on par with running a small factory, and the laundry maids were its overworked employees. Their workplace, a room perpetually hot, damp and loud. The laundry room, which resembled a steamy dungeon filled with copper vats, washboards, and a smell best described as wet everything. The process began with water, endless gallons of it. With no modern plumbing in many homes, water had to be carried from wells, pumps, or cisterns in heavy buckets. This alone was grueling, but worse still, the water had to be heated in massive copper tubs over fires. Laundry maids spent their mornings tending flames and hauling buckets just to get enough hot water ready to begin. The kitchen had its smoke. The laundry had its steam, filling the room until it clung to skin and hair, making every breath feel like sipping from a boiling kettle. Once the water was hot, the real work began. Clothes, linens, and undergarments were plunged into the bubbling cauldrons and boiled. Boiling wasn't just for cleanliness. It was about obliterating germs and odors in an age obsessed with hygiene as a marker of morality. A gentleman's shirt collar or a lady's petticoat wasn't merely fabric, it was a public statement of purity. Behind that pristine statement were laundry maids sweating over cauldrons, stirring cloth with long wooden paddles to avoid scalding their hands. After boiling came the scrubbing. Laundry maids bent over washboards, rubbing fabric back and forth with soap made from lye or soda, substances so caustic they stripped oils from both fabric and skin. Hands cracked and bled from constant exposure, knuckles rubbed raw, nails permanently ruined. And this wasn't a matter of 1 or 2 garments, it was heaps. Shirts, gowns, trousers, sheets, tablecloths, napkins, towels. Each week the laundry room became a mountain range of soiled cloth, and the maids were the climbers with no summit in sight. The worst offenders were sheets. The family expected crisp, clean bedding at all times, which meant enormous, heavy linen sheets had to be washed, wrung and dried constantly. Wringing sheets by hand was an ordeal in itself. Imagine twisting yards of waterlogged fabric until your arms ached and your shoulders threatened mutiny. Later, some houses acquired mangles, large rollers that squeezed water out of fabric, but even these demanded brute strength to operate. Laundry maids often developed muscular arms from the sheer physicality of their work, though there was little glory in being the strongest person in the basement. And then came starching. Shirts, collars, and even table linens had to be stiffened with starch to achieve the crisp, unyielding perfection Victorians adored. Laundry maids dipped items into starch mixtures, dried them, and then ironed them within an inch of their lives. The irons themselves were heavy blocks of metal heated in the fire, scorching hot to the touch, and entirely unforgiving. Burns were inevitable, as were ruined garments if an iron left a mark. A perfect collar could mean silent acceptance upstairs. A crooked one might earn a scolding that erased hours of effort. Drying laundry was another logistical nightmare. In summer, sheets and clothes were hung outside on lines, turning the garden into a fluttering sea of white. In winter, or in houses without adequate space, drying meant stringing garments across indoor racks, filling every corner of the laundry room with dripping cloth. The air became humid and suffocating, a steamy fog that coated everything with dampness. Maids coughed, clothes mildewed, and the work never slowed. The sheer relentlessness of laundry made it one of the most dreaded tasks in service. Unlike cooking, which produced a meal, or polishing, which created shine, laundry left little satisfaction. The minute it was done, the next pile arrived. A family's endless wardrobe changes, combined with guests, children, and the servants' own uniforms, ensured that laundry was never finished. It was a treadmill of soaking, scrubbing, wringing, starching, ironing, and drying that stretched from week to week, year to year. Laundry maids earned some of the lowest wages in service. a cruel irony given how back-breaking their work was. They were usually young women from poor backgrounds, often starting as teenagers, who spent their best years inhaling steam and scalding their skin for pennies. Few households bothered to appreciate them. The family simply expected fresh, clean linen as naturally as they expected the sun to rise, with no thought of the agony downstairs that made it possible. And yet, without them, the entire illusion of refinement would collapse. Crisp collars and spotless sheets weren't luxuries, they were social weapons. A guest who noticed a stained napkin might gossip about the family's standards. A wrinkled tablecloth could brand a household as careless. Clean laundry was as much about class as cleanliness, and laundry maids bore the brunt of maintaining that fragile facade. They labored in anonymity, their sweat woven into every spotless shirt front and polished table setting. The laundry room was the hidden furnace of the Victorian household, where human endurance was boiled, wrung, and pressed alongside the family's linens. For the laundry maids, life was an endless cycle of steam and drudgery, with little chance of escape. They weren't just washing clothes, they were washing away the visible traces of human life, so the family upstairs could pretend their world was spotless. And in the end, their work was both invisible and indispensable. The silent backbone of respectability, ironed flat under the weight of endless shirts and sheets. In the glittering halls upstairs, meals were a spectacle. Silver platters, pyramids of fruit, puddings wobbling like geological events, and joints of meat carved with theatrical precision. Downstairs in the servants' hall, the dining experience was a little less majestic. They had lobster, you had porridge that looked like wallpaper paste. Welcome to the culinary divide of the Victorian household, where the masters feasted and the servants filled their stomachs with whatever was cheapest, stodgiest, and least likely to kill them quickly. Servants' meals were practical, not pleasurable. The goal wasn't fine dining, it was fuel. After all, these men and women were on their feet 16 hours a day, scrubbing, carrying, hauling, and polishing. They needed calories, and lots of them. But calories came in the form of carbohydrates, not luxury. Bread, porridge, stews made from the cheapest cuts, and endless potatoes were the staples. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept bodies moving. And the portions? Large, yes, but never indulgent. You might be served a hunk of bread so heavy it could double as a doorstop, but you wouldn't be savoring delicate sauces or sipping aged wines. Meat did appear on the servants' table, but rarely the good stuff. Families upstairs claimed the best cuts, succulent roasts, tenderloins, juicy fillets, while the servants got what remained, offcuts, bones for soup, and organs that polite society pretended didn't exist. Liver, kidney, tripe, and other variety meats were common fare. If you were lucky, they were cooked into stews hearty enough to disguise their texture. If you weren't, you were staring down a plate of boiled offal with a smile you didn't feel. It was food that filled your belly but rarely lifted your spirits. Fish told a similar story. The family might dine on salmon or turbot while servants were left with herrings or mackerel. Cheap, oily, and pungent, these were the fish of the working classes, and while upstairs they might pick daintily at a delicately poached sole, downstairs you were trying to swallow something that tasted like the ocean had gone slightly off. Salted fish and dried herring were common, stretching cheap protein into meals that lingered on your breath far longer than anyone wanted. Breakfast was perhaps the starkest contrast. Upstairs, a Victorian breakfast might include eggs, bacon, sausages, kidneys, toast, jams, and even game. Downstairs, breakfast was often cold tea and porridge, thick, grey, and unappetizing. Occasionally, bread and dripping, fat skimmed from roasts, made an appearance, a spread that could generously be described as greasy survival. It wasn't exciting, but it kept you upright until luncheon, when you'd likely be chewing on more bread and stew. The irony, of course, was proximity. Servants prepared the grand meals, smelled the roasting meats, basted the game, glazed the pastries, and carried them aloft into the dining room, only to return downstairs to eat leftovers or a pared-down version. The smell of luxury hovered constantly, but the taste rarely reached their tongues. A footman might salivate over a roast pheasant he served at table, then return to the servants' hall to eat boiled cabbage. It was culinary cruelty. plain and simple. That said, leftovers occasionally softened the blow. If guests left food on their plates or if dishes were too much for the family, some scraps trickled down to the servants. A slice of cake, a piece of roast, or a wedge of cheese could brighten an otherwise dreary meal. But this depended entirely on the generosity or indifference of the family and the butler's control of the larder. In some houses, leftovers were strictly rationed or even locked away, ensuring the family's waste remained waste. In others, servants could sample the edges of luxury in small, tantalizing bites. Meals in the servants' hall were also rigidly structured by rank. Just as upstairs had strict etiquette, so too did downstairs. The butler presided at the head of the table, the housekeeper opposite him, and everyone else sat according to their place in the hierarchy. The scullery maid didn't just suffer the worst work, she also got the worst seat, the coldest scraps, and the least respect. Dining, even in the servants' hall, was never free of class distinctions. Eating wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was about reinforcing order. For many servants, the monotony of food added to their misery. Day after day of porridge, potatoes, and stews dulled the senses. Little variety meant meals blurred together. One maid later recalled that she could hardly remember a single dish from her years in service, except that it was always filling but rarely satisfying. Food was fuel, nothing more, and any hope of enjoyment was swallowed along with lumps of boiled turnip. The health consequences were mixed. On one hand, servants got enough calories to keep working, which was better than many labourers outside service who sometimes starved. On the other hand, the diet was heavy, bland, and lacking in fresh fruits and vegetables. Malnutrition, anemia, and digestive issues weren't uncommon. Ironically, servants spent their lives preparing balanced, lavish meals for their masters, while subsisting on diets that slowly wore them down. And yet, in the rare moments when something indulgent found its way onto the servant's table, a roast bone with scraps of meat, a pudding too lopsided for upstairs, there was a flicker of joy. These moments became stories, retold with glee, proof that life wasn't all gruel and grease. They were small mercies, stolen victories in a system built on inequity. In the end, servants' meals told the story of Victorian service as clearly as any bell or broom. Upstairs, food was culture, power, and display. Downstairs, it was necessity, stripped of pleasure, designed only to sustain the labor that made luxury possible. The family dined on status, the servants dined on survival. And while the upstairs table glittered with lobster and wine, the servants' hall echoed with the sound of spoons scraping the last of the porridge from a chipped bowl. If the drawing room upstairs was a stage for polite conversation, the servants' hall downstairs was its gritty, unvarnished counterpart. A world where laughter, gossip, and the occasional argument unfolded under the watchful eye of hierarchy. It was the one space where servants could sit, eat, and catch their breath after endless hours of work. But don't be fooled. Even relaxation came with rules and a seating chart of doom. The servants' hall was typically a long, plain room with heavy tables, hard benches, and very little in the way of comfort. No gilded mirrors, no velvet chairs, just bare essentials that reflected the belief that servants didn't need luxury, only function. But to those who lived their lives running up and down stairs, hauling coal, and scrubbing floors, this unadorned room was still a sanctuary. It was where they ate their meals, shared jokes, and exchanged tidbits of information they couldn't voice upstairs. For a few stolen moments each day, the masks of silent deference slipped, and servants became themselves again, or at least as close to themselves as the hierarchy allowed. Because yes, even in the servants' hall, hierarchy loomed large. Seating was strictly regulated. At the head of the table sat the butler, with the housekeeper opposite him, like a king and queen ruling their own miniature court. Next came senior staff, the cook, the lady's maid, the valet, each with their carefully assigned seats. Lower-ranking servants like chambermaids, kitchen maids, and scullery maids were relegated to the far end of the table. Sitting out of turn was not just a faux pas. It was a challenge to order, the sort of thing that could spark sharp words or lasting grudges. Even in their moments of rest, Servants were reminded that they had a place, and woe betide anyone who forgot it. Conversation in the servants' hall was one of its defining features. Freed from the suffocating silence required upstairs, servants let loose their voices here. Gossip was the lifeblood of the hall. Who had flirted with whom? Who had displeased the cook? What scandal the master's daughter might be courting with her piano tutor? The housekeeper might discourage too much chatter, but in practice, gossip was impossible to police. Servants were the eyes and ears of the household, and what they saw they discussed. After all, when you're invisible upstairs, downstairs becomes the only place where your observations carry weight. But the hall wasn't just about gossip. It was also about companionship. Servants shared the same grueling schedule, the same exhaustion, and the same frustrations. A shared laugh over a guest's ridiculous demands or a mutual groan over the endless polishing of brass created bonds. In some households, the hall echoed with laughter and teasing, serving as a kind of pressure valve for the constant strain of service. In others, silence prevailed, enforced by stern butlers who demanded even rest be orderly. The atmosphere depended heavily on the personalities in charge. Food in the servants' hall, as discussed in the previous chapter, was plain, but the act of eating together gave it a social dimension. A bowl of stew might not taste better because you were sitting on a hard bench, but sharing it with others made the ordeal of service slightly more bearable. Meals were also moments for observing rank in action. The butler might carve meat for the table, symbolically echoing the rituals upstairs, while lower servants waited their turn, sometimes receiving only scraps. Eating here was less about nourishment and more about reinforcing the invisible chain of command. Discipline reached even into leisure. Some households allowed a bit of singing or card playing after supper, giving servants a chance to unwind. Others frowned on such activities, expecting staff to spend their scant free time mending clothes, writing letters home, or simply preparing for the next day. Free time was a relative term in service, never entirely free, always overshadowed by the next bell, the next demand, the next day of labor looming just hours away. One of the strangest aspects of the servants' hall was its dual role, both a refuge and a cage. For many servants, it was the only place where they could speak their minds, laugh openly, or even just sit without performing deference. But it was also a place where the hierarchy was inescapable, where the reminder of rank followed them even in supposed rest. To sit at the wrong end of the table, to speak out of turn, to step outside the unspoken rules. These were small rebellions with large consequences. The hall offered relief but never freedom. And yet, despite its restrictions, the servants' hall had its own culture. It was a place of stories and memory, where younger servants listened to the tales of older ones, learning the unspoken rules of the trade. It was where friendships were formed, romances quietly hinted at, and rivalries sharpened. It was where laughter echoed against stone walls after the absurdities of upstairs life became too much to bear. For all its rigidity, it was the heart of downstairs life, the place where servants forged a community out of shared struggle. In the end, the servants' hall was a mirror image of the mansion itself. Upstairs, the family dined in splendor, surrounded by ritual and hierarchy. Downstairs, the servants did the same, just without the silverware, the compliments or the comfortable chairs. Both halls reinforced order, both halls displayed status, and both halls kept everyone in their place. The difference was that upstairs, hierarchy meant power and privilege, while downstairs it meant endurance. For the servants, the hall was the space where they could be seen by each other at least, after a day of being invisible. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't free, but it was theirs. And if laughter carried from the far end of the table, or gossip buzzed beneath the housekeeper's glare, it was proof that even in the most rigid system, humanity had a way of sneaking in, settling down and sharing a bowl of stew. Love, as poets tell us, is supposed to make the heart sing, the cheeks blush, and the soul soar. In Victorian service, however, love was more likely to make the housekeeper scowl, the butler glare, and your job vanish in an instant. Fall in love and risk being unemployed. Romance never looked so exhausting. Victorian mansions were pressure cookers of emotion. Dozens of young men and women, most of them in their teens or early 20s, lived together under one roof, working long hours, sharing cramped spaces, and rarely venturing beyond the estate walls. It was inevitable that glances would be exchanged across the servants' hall. Hands would brush when passing a tray, or stolen smiles would linger longer than they should. But while romance was natural, it was also dangerous. Service demanded discretion, obedience, and invisibility, three qualities that young love tended to shatter. The rules were clear, servants were discouraged, sometimes outright forbidden from fraternizing. Masters and mistresses expected their staff to devote themselves entirely to duty, not to moonlit trysts in the garden. A maid distracted by love was, in their eyes, a maid distracted from polishing brass. A footman who spent too much time lingering near the laundry might find himself abruptly dismissed, regardless of whether he'd actually done anything improper. The threat of losing employment hung over every stolen moment, which made romance both thrilling and terrifying. Courtship often unfolded in the cracks of the day. A quick word exchanged when carrying trays, a conspiratorial smile in the corridor, or a note slipped between folded linens. Servants became experts at communicating without speaking, at saying everything with a glance. In the servants' hall, seating arrangements made conversation difficult, but a kind word during clean-up or a shared chore could blossom into something more. In this way, love grew in the smallest of spaces, watered by secrecy and fertilized by risk. Still, there were moments when romance flourished openly, though never without consequences. Engagements between servants did occur, often celebrated with modest gifts or small gatherings downstairs. But marriage presented a problem. Many households did not allow married couples to remain in service together, especially if it disrupted the delicate balance of rank. For a maid to marry a footman often meant one or both had to leave their positions. Love wasn't just a personal choice, it was an economic gamble. The decision to follow your heart might mean losing your livelihood. And then there were the scandals. Affairs between servants and their masters, though frowned upon, were not unheard of. A wealthy gentleman might take an inappropriate interest in a housemaid, or a bored young mistress might flirt with a handsome footman. For the servant, this kind of attention was a double-edged sword. Refusal could mean dismissal. Acceptance could mean ruin. A maid caught in such an entanglement risked her reputation and her job, and if pregnancy followed, the consequences were devastating. While the family could usually hush up a scandal, the servant bore the stigma and the loss of her place. Many such stories ended with ruined lives, whispered rumors, or desperate relocations to escape disgrace. Even relationships between servants of equal rank were fraught with difficulty. Privacy was nearly impossible in crowded quarters where everyone knew everyone else's business. Gossip spread faster than coal dust in the kitchen, and a single rumor could reach the housekeeper before the couple themselves knew they were an item. Some romances survived the scrutiny, blossoming into marriages that led couples out of service and into other forms of work. Others fizzled under the weight of constant watchfulness, leaving only awkward silences in the servants' hall. Despite the dangers, romance persisted because it offered something rare: hope. For many servants, life was an endless cycle of labor and exhaustion. Love, even in its secret and fragile form, was a reminder that they were more than cogs in a machine. A kind word from a fellow servant could soften the sting of a scolding. A stolen kiss in the scullery could make another 14-hour day bearable. Love didn't erase hardship, but it gave meaning to lives that otherwise seemed defined entirely by service. The humor, of course, lay in the absurd lengths servants went to keep love hidden. A maid sneaking out to meet her sweetheart in the garden might pretend she was checking the laundry. A footman caught lingering near the kitchen might claim he was inspecting the coal. The elaborate excuses, whispered meetings, and frantic attempts to dodge the housekeeper's suspicious eye turned romance into a kind of covert operation. Cupid didn't just shoot arrows, he fired them under the table, through corridors and into broom closets. And yet, while forbidden, romance was not entirely unacknowledged. Some housekeepers, hardened though they were, turned a blind eye to harmless flirtations so long as work wasn't affected. Others tolerated engagements if the servants were discreet and hard-working. It was a precarious balance. Too much indulgence could breed chaos, but too strict a rule could breed resentment. In the end, love was as much a part of service life as dusting, though far riskier and far more complicated. In the grand halls upstairs, love was performed in the open dances, letters, formal proposals, and carefully arranged marriages. Downstairs, it was whispered, hidden, fragile, and often tinged with fear, but that secrecy gave it a peculiar intensity. A servant might remember for years the thrill of a first kiss stolen by the back stairs, or the warmth of a hand briefly held under the dinner table. These small moments became lifelines, treasured long after the shine of silver or the ache of scrubbing had faded. Ultimately, courtship and romance among Victorian servants was less about happy endings and more about fleeting escapes. Love rarely rewrote their destinies, but it gave them stories, laughter, and sometimes heartbreak that reminded them they were human, not just uniforms in a hierarchy. In a world where even rest came with rules, love was the one thing that couldn't be completely polished away, even if it might cost you your job. If you were a Victorian servant assigned to the care of children, your life was a peculiar mix of joy, exhaustion, and heartbreak. You raised their children better than they ever would, then watched them grow up to ignore you. The world of nannies, governesses, and nursemaids was a strange corner of service, where servants were closer to the family than most, but never close enough to escape being treated as hired help. The nanny was the general in charge of the nursery. She wasn't just a babysitter. She was the iron disciplinarian who kept order in the chaos of childhood. With her starched apron, sensible shoes, and endless patience, or at least the appearance of it, she managed feeding schedules, nap times, schooling, and scraped knees. The children often saw more of her than they did of their parents. In fact, many upper-class mothers considered daily contact with their children unnecessary, even unfashionable. The logic went, why bother with sticky fingers and tantrums when a servant could deal with it? That left the nanny as the true architect of childhood, shaping manners, habits, and sometimes even morals. Beneath the nanny were the nursemaids, who did the hands-on drudgery. They rocked the babies, changed the nappies, cloth, endlessly washed and boiled, carried toddlers around the garden, and sat up at night with sickly little ones. Their hours were endless, their quarters often right next to the nursery so they could be summoned at all hours, and their reward was exhaustion on a scale even other servants found remarkable. But for the nursemaids, the bond with the children could be deep. They were the ones little ones clung to, cried for, and confided in. And yet that bond was bittersweet, because when the children grew up, they rarely remembered the nursemaid's devotion with the gratitude it deserved. Then there were the governesses, the strangest figures of all in the servant world. They weren't quite staff, but they weren't family either. Often educated women from middle-class backgrounds fallen on hard times. Governesses were tasked with teaching children literature, languages, music, and manners. They dined separately, lived separately, and occupied a social no-man's land, too genteel to eat in the servants' hall, not high enough to sit with the family. They often ate alone, reading by lamplight in their small rooms. Their loneliness became legendary. Novelists like Charlotte Bronte mined it for every drop of Gothic melancholy in Jane Eyre. The nursery itself was its own little kingdom, often located at the top of the house or in a distant wing, away from the elegant rooms where adults entertained. Stocked with toys, cribs, and sometimes even miniature furniture, it was the domain of the servants who ran it. Parents might visit occasionally, perhaps for a half-hour of supervised play, but for the most part, it was servants who handled the messy, noisy, and unpredictable business of raising children. This separation was so extreme that some children grew up barely recognizing their own parents, instead treating the nanny as their true guardian. One boy famously burst into tears when his mama took him from the nanny's arms. He simply had no idea who the strange lady was. Servants in the nursery weren't just caretakers, they were moral instructors. Nannies enforced discipline with sharp words or the occasional smack, instilling obedience and propriety. Governesses drilled French verbs and piano scales into reluctant pupils. Nursemaids taught basic hygiene and manners, making sure little hands were washed and little mouths remembered please and thank you. In many cases, these servants shaped the personalities of the children who would one day inherit estates, titles, and wealth. The irony was staggering. The people least valued by society were the very ones molding its future leaders. The emotional toll was perhaps the hardest part. Servants often grew deeply attached to the children in their care. They celebrated their first steps, soothed their fevers, and listened to their bedtime fears. Yet, as those children grew, affection often faded into indifference. When a young heir was sent off to school or a daughter was introduced to society, the nanny or governess who had raised them might be quietly dismissed, her years of devotion reduced to a passing mention. For many servants, the heartbreak of being forgotten was sharper than the drudgery of work. To be loved fiercely by a child, and then abandoned by the adult they became, was a wound that rarely healed. Still, there were lighter moments. The nursery could be chaotic, but it also held laughter, play, and a sense of life absent from the formality of the drawing rooms. Servants might invent games, tell stories, or sneak treats to their charges, finding joy in small rebellions against the rigidity of the household. A governess might delight in a bright pupil, or a nursemaid might treasure the affection of a child who clung to her skirts. These moments of warmth didn't erase the hardship, but they offered a glimpse of humanity in a world otherwise ruled by bells and polish. Romance among nursery staff was especially tricky. A nursemaid carrying a baby around the garden might attract glances from a footman, but the housekeeper's suspicion loomed larger than ever. After all, the nursery wasn't just about care, it was about reputation. A scandal involving a governess or nanny could stain the household name. So even in the nursery, love and longing had to stay hidden, tucked away like broken toys at the bottom of the chest. In the end, servants who raised children occupied one of the strangest, most contradictory positions in service. They were essential, yet undervalued. They were loved, yet forgotten. They gave their youth, energy, and hearts to raising other people's children, all while knowing that their efforts would rarely be recognized. Upstairs, parents might boast of their children's accomplishments, but downstairs the servants who made those accomplishments possible quietly carried on with the next generation of sticky fingers and runny noses. Victorian mansions may have glittered with wealth, but behind every polished drawing room stood a nursery filled with children whose lives were shaped not by their aristocratic parents, but by the nannies, governesses, and nursemaids who served them. And if those children grew up to believe their poise, knowledge, and refinement came naturally, it was only because the women downstairs had worked themselves ragged to make it look that way. When you picture a holiday, you might imagine sunlit beaches, mountain hikes, or even just the sweet bliss of sleeping in. For a Victorian servant, however, the concept of time off was about as mythical as unicorns or polite dinner guests who didn't ring the bell 6 times for more wine. At best, you might get 1 day off a month if lucky. Your big vacation? Walking to church in shoes that hate you. Time off wasn't considered a right. It was a privilege, granted sparingly, and often begrudgingly. The Victorian household ran on the assumption that servants existed to serve, full stop. If you were absent, someone else had to cover your duties, and that caused a ripple of chaos that masters were loath to tolerate. So 1 day off a month was the standard in many houses, though off didn't mean the same as it does today. It wasn't a lazy Saturday sprawled on the couch. It was a rigidly defined window in which you might escape the house, visit family, or most often attend church. Church wasn't just about religion, it was about reputation. Masters wanted their servants to be seen as moral, upright members of society, even if they worked them half to death the rest of the week. A servant who skipped church might reflect badly on the household, suggesting lax discipline. So, while a day off technically allowed you to choose how to spend it, in reality, Sunday morning was often spoken for. You marched to church, aching feet stuffed into stiff boots, sat through the sermon, and then trudged back with only a sliver of freedom left in your holiday. What did servants do with those precious free hours? Many used the time to see family, though that often meant long walks across town or even into the countryside. Imagine setting off after dawn, walking miles to see your parents or siblings, sharing a quick meal, and then turning right back around to be back in uniform by evening. The effort was enormous, the visits heartbreakingly short. Still, those brief reunions were lifelines, reminders that life existed beyond the mansion's walls. Others spent their time socializing with fellow servants from nearby houses. Taverns, parks, and marketplaces became the hubs of servant society, where gossip was exchanged, friendships rekindled, and sometimes romance sparked. These outings were vital escapes from the rigid hierarchy of the household, moments where you could laugh without worrying about the butler's disapproving cough or the housekeeper's raised eyebrow. Of course, even here, you were still marked by your status. Your clothing gave you away instantly, and while you might be free for a few hours, the world never let you forget that you were in service. There were also errands, not glamorous ones, but the kind you never had time for during the week. Buying small necessities, stockings, soap, a ribbon if you could spare the pennies, often filled your so-called holiday. Writing letters, mending your own clothes, or catching up on chores that served you rather than the family, also ate into the day. For many, the only leisure was sitting quietly with a book or dozing on a bench before trudging back to the house. Some masters were stricter than others. In the most controlling households, even the monthly day off was reduced or withheld, especially during busy seasons like Christmas or when guests filled the house. Servants might go months without leaving, their world shrinking to the endless cycle of bells, brooms, and basins. The psychological strain was immense, feeling trapped in a grand house that was beautiful for everyone except those who couldn't escape it. Then there was the suspicion. Masters and mistresses often fretted about what their servants did during time off. They worried about moral corruption, illicit romances, or heaven forbid, political meetings. In an era when working-class movements and unions were beginning to stir, keeping servants isolated was a way of preventing them from organizing. A day off was meant to be a small release, not an opportunity to gain independence. Too much freedom was considered dangerous. And yet, despite the restrictions, those rare holidays were fiercely cherished. Servants counted down to them, planned them meticulously, and spoke of them with the excitement others reserved for actual vacations. A walk in the countryside could feel like a breath of freedom. A cup of ale at a tavern could taste like rebellion. A stolen afternoon with a sweetheart was worth more than gold. These moments were tiny sparks of life in an otherwise suffocating existence. The cruel irony was that servants often returned from their days off more exhausted than when they left. Walking miles to see family, running errands, sitting through sermons in drafty churches, all of it drained rather than refreshed. But no one dared complain. Gratitude was expected, even for crumbs of freedom. To grumble about the lack of rest was to risk being labeled ungrateful, and ungrateful servants were expendable. In truth, holidays revealed the core contradiction of Victorian service. Servants lived full-time in households where they were indispensable, yet their humanity was acknowledged only in fleeting moments. They were allowed just enough time to maintain ties to the outside world, but never enough to fully belong to it. They lived in a limbo, not quite part of the family, not quite free individuals, but something in between. Useful bodies loaned an occasional day to remember they were people. So yes, a servant's holiday wasn't a week by the seaside or a trip abroad. It was a few short hours, carved out of endless labor, filled with church errands or rushed visits. Yet to those living the life, even those crumbs mattered, because sometimes freedom isn't measured in beaches or mountains. It's measured in footsteps away from the mansion, in conversations shared in taverns, in the sight of a familiar face across a crowded church pew. It was brief, imperfect, and exhausting, but it was theirs. If the endless labor of Victorian service didn't wear you down, the accidents and illnesses surely would. Life below stairs was lived on the edge of exhaustion, and with exhaustion came mistakes, spilled water, dropped coal scuttles, a misstep on the stairs. In a world where every movement involved hauling, scrubbing, or carrying something heavy, injuries weren't rare, they were inevitable. And here's the fun part. Twist an ankle? Congratulations, you just invented job loss. The hazards began with the house itself. Victorian mansions weren't built with safety in mind for the people running them. Narrow staircases, steep back passages, and dim lighting made every trip a gamble. Servants rushed up and down carrying trays stacked with dishes, buckets of water, or logs for the fire. One stumble could mean a tray of shattered china or a broken wrist. A footman who tripped in the dining room might be laughed at by guests, but downstairs he could expect a dressing down from the butler, followed by weeks of pain without medical care. Burns were another constant menace. Cooks, kitchen maids, and scullery girls worked over open coal ranges, hauling pots of boiling water or fat that hissed and spat like angry serpents. A slip of the ladle and hot grease could scar a servant for life. Laundry maids, too, worked with searing hot irons heated in the fire, and one inattentive moment could mean scorched flesh. Servants bore their burns with grim endurance, bandaged, ignored, and expected to get back to work the next day. After all, soup wouldn't serve itself just because your skin was blistering. Then there were the chronic conditions born of daily labor. Endless scrubbing on cold stone floors ruined knees and backs. Lugging buckets of water warped spines and strained muscles. Dust and soot from fires filled lungs, causing coughs that never seemed to go away. The laundry room's perpetual steam left many maids wheezing, while others developed rheumatism from working in damp conditions. Servants' bodies often aged long before their time, their youth consumed by the grind of keeping the household pristine. And when illness struck, life became even harsher. Servants had little to no access to proper medical care. Doctors were expensive, and a master might hesitate to pay for one unless the servant was considered particularly valuable. More often, sickness was treated with home remedies: vinegar for fevers, poultices for coughs, rest if you were lucky. But rest was rare. Ill or not, the work had to go on. A chambermaid with a head cold still had fires to light. A footman with a fever was still expected to stand straight in livery. Sick days were a luxury Victorian servants simply didn't have. Contagion was a constant fear. Servants lived in close quarters, slept in cramped dormitories, and shared air thick with coal smoke. Illness spread like wildfire. Coughs turned into consumption, small infections into festering wounds, and without antibiotics, even minor ailments could spiral into something deadly. A cut from a knife in the kitchen, a blister from hauling coal, these were gateways to infections that might end a life. The cruelest part was the lack of security. Injury or illness often meant dismissal. Masters and mistresses weren't running charities. A servant who couldn't perform their duties was expendable. A scullery maid who sprained her ankle hauling water might find herself replaced within days, her wages cut off just when she needed them most. The servant class had no sick pay, no compensation, and no safety net. If you couldn't work, you couldn't earn. If you couldn't earn, you didn't eat. Survival depended on sheer resilience, or sheer luck. For female servants, illness carried an additional stigma. A young maid weakened by poor diet or long hours might faint on duty, earning her the label of fragile or unsuitable. Governesses battling exhaustion might be accused of hysteria, a diagnosis so vague it excused dismissing them without hesitation. Pregnancy out of wedlock, whether by consent or coercion, was its own form of illness in the eyes of Victorian morality, leading almost invariably to dismissal and disgrace. For women in service, the margin for survival was even thinner, and let's not forget the brutal absence of anesthesia in many cases. Servants injured badly enough to require surgery faced nightmarish prospects. Broken bones were set without pain relief beyond strong drink, amputations performed with saws in grim silence. Even dental care was agony. An aching tooth might mean extraction by brute force, no numbing, no mercy. For a servant, the choice was between unbearable pain untreated or unbearable pain treated with crude tools. Either way, it wasn't a happy ending. Yet, Amid the horror, servants adapted with dark humor. They joked about coughs that never left, burns that proved their worth in the kitchen, or the bruises that came with carrying trays up endless stairs. Complaints were disguised as banter, laughter masking despair. It was a survival mechanism as essential as bread or sleep. After all, if you couldn't laugh at the fact that you were limping through work with a twisted ankle while polishing boots for someone who never touched mud, what else could you do? In the grand ledger of Victorian society, servants' bodies were treated as expendable resources. They bent, broke, burned, and bled to keep households running, and when they failed, they were replaced. Upstairs, luxury gleamed. Downstairs, behind the shine, were scarred hands, aching backs, and lungs choked with coal. The invisible price of refinement was paid in flesh, and the servants bore it silently, because to cry out was to admit weakness, and weakness was a luxury none of them could afford. For all the endless scrubbing, polishing, hauling, and smiling through gritted teeth, the financial rewards of Victorian service were underwhelming, to put it kindly. Your paycheck could buy bread, maybe butter if you skipped rent. Wages in service were low, deliberately so, because the system ran not on money, but on the illusion of perks, room board, and the privilege of being worked half to death under a roof slightly fancier than the one you came from. Let's start with wages. A scullery maid, the bottom of the ladder, might earn a paltry £8 a year, not a month, not a week, a year. That's barely enough for shoes that didn't leave your toes praying for release. Kitchen maids and chambermaids did a little better, perhaps £10–15 annually. Footmen might climb higher with £20 or even £25, especially if they were tall, good-looking, and had calves impressive enough to make the mistress's friends swoon. Butlers and housekeepers, perched at the top of the servant pyramid, could pull in £50 or more a year, occasionally supplemented by bonuses. It was a fortune compared to the scullery maid's pennies, but still meagre when compared to the wealth of the family they served. Tips helped soften the blow, though they came irregularly and mostly for visible staff. Footmen serving at table might earn extra coins slipped from grateful or drunk guests. But tips were unreliable, depending more on the guest's generosity than the servant's effort. Worse still, in many houses, tips weren't kept directly. They were collected by the butler and distributed fairly. Fairly, of course, often meant the higher-ranking staff got larger shares while the lowliest servants ended up with crumbs. In theory, it prevented squabbling. In practice, it reinforced the hierarchy that governed every inch of servant life. Room and board were touted as perks, but they were double-edged swords. Yes, you had a roof over your head and meals of a sort provided, but the rooms were cramped, damp, and often freezing. Servants slept in attics, basements, or converted closets, with little privacy and walls so thin you could hear your neighbor's every cough. Food, as covered earlier, was fuel rather than cuisine: bread, porridge, stew, repeat. Families liked to pretend they were generous by feeding and housing their staff, but in reality these benefits were simply ways to justify low wages. After all, why pay people more if you're already giving them a place to sleep and something vaguely edible? Uniforms were another supposed perk, though often they were more punishment than privilege. Some households provided livery or aprons, but many deducted the cost from servants' wages. Imagine working 14-hour days and then finding part of your pay siphoned off so you could buy the very cap you were required to wear. For women, the endless washing and mending of uniforms meant additional unpaid labor. Perk was a generous word for what was, in reality, another financial drain. Boarding in the master's house also came with invisible costs: your time and your freedom. Living on site meant you were never truly off duty. A bell might ring at midnight, a guest might arrive unannounced, and suddenly you were back in uniform. You couldn't slip home to rest after your shift because your home was the same place where you served. The family owned not just your labor but your presence, your silence, and your obedience. Room and board weren't perks. They were shackles binding you to the house day and night. Savings were almost impossible. A frugal servant might squirrel away a few coins each month, hoping one day to marry or leave service. Some managed to send small amounts home to support aging parents or siblings. But wages were so low that any unexpected expense, a new pair of boots, a doctor's fee, a family emergency, could wipe out months of savings in an instant. For most, service was a cycle of survival, not advancement. You worked to eat, and you ate to work. Still, there were rare cases where service paid off in other ways. Some servants, especially butlers and housekeepers, received gifts or perquisites from their employers. Cast-off clothing, leftover wine, or even small allowances for years of loyalty. A lady's maid might inherit old gowns when her mistress tired of them, selling or altering them for her own use. Valets could occasionally profit by receiving their master's unwanted suits. These hand-me-downs were practical windfalls, though they also highlighted the dependence servants had on scraps of generosity. The cruel truth was that the biggest perk of service wasn't the money, or even the room and board, it was respectability. In an age when factory work was grueling and often unsafe, domestic service offered a veneer of stability. Wearing a uniform and serving in a fine house carried a kind of social legitimacy that working in a mill did not. Families back home might boast that their daughter was a parlour maid or their son a footman. The job might be miserable, but it was honourable misery, dressed up in aprons and buttons, and yet respectability didn't pay the bills. The reality for most servants was a lifetime of hard work with little to show for it. Few retired with savings, many ended up dependent on relatives or charity in old age. Their years of labour had maintained the luxury of others, but left them with little more than tired bodies and memories of service. If perks existed, they were fleeting. If wages mattered, they were barely enough. And if room and board counted as benefits, they were benefits designed to keep you close, obedient, and always available. Victorian families may have lived in glittering comfort, but their luxury rested on the backs of people whose entire financial worth might equal the cost of one dinner party upstairs. The pay was meagre, the perks illusory, and the promise of advancement slim. Service wasn't a golden ticket. It was a contract of survival, signed in bread crusts and cramped rooms, binding you to a life where even butter was a luxury you had to think twice about. Victorian mansions may have looked respectable on the outside. Stately facades, manicured gardens and drawing rooms polished to perfection. But peel back the wallpaper and you'd find something far messier. Below stairs, where servants toiled and whispered, the air was thick not only with coal dust but with secrets. Affairs, theft and blackmail weren't just the stuff of lurid novels, they were woven into the fabric of servant life. If walls could talk, they'd ask for hush money. Servants were in the unique position of seeing everything and being seen by no one. They overheard hushed conversations in hallways, glimpsed clandestine meetings in gardens, and handled private letters left carelessly on desks. They carried chamber pots, folded linens, and served meals, all while absorbing the unguarded habits of the household. Unlike the guests upstairs, servants didn't have the luxury of pretending not to notice. The result? A treasure trove of gossip that could both entertain and destroy. Affairs were perhaps the most common scandal, sometimes between servants themselves, often between masters and staff. A handsome footman catching the eye of a bored mistress, a maid flattered into secrecy by the master's attention. Such stories circulated endlessly. For the servant involved, it was a dangerous tightrope. Refuse, and you risked dismissal. Accept, and you risked disgrace if discovered. A pregnancy out of wedlock could end a maid's career in an instant. For the family upstairs, scandal meant whispers at dinner parties. For the servant, it meant poverty and ruin. Yet these liaisons happened often enough to fill countless novels and, more importantly, countless servants' halls with whispers. Then there was theft, an unspoken reality of service life. With so many valuables lying around, temptation was constant. Silver spoons, handkerchiefs, jewelry. Small items could vanish without immediate notice. Some thefts were petty, born of desperation. A maid pocketing leftover food to feed a sibling. A laundry maid borrowing a ribbon discarded by her mistress. Others were grander, involving carefully planned schemes to pilfer and pawn valuables. Most servants never dared, but the few who did risked everything. If caught, punishment could be severe: instant dismissal, criminal charges, even prison. Yet for some, the chance of escape from grinding poverty outweighed the risk of a tarnished conscience. Blackmail was rarer, but when it happened it was explosive. Servants who knew too much about affairs, gambling debts, or embarrassing habits sometimes wielded their knowledge as a weapon. Imagine the power of a valet who had dressed his master for years, privy to every letter, every indiscretion, or a lady's maid who knew which letters were burned and which were hidden in drawers. While most servants valued discretion, after all, their jobs depended on it, a desperate few found ways to leverage secrets. The irony, of course, is that the system which made them invisible also made them the most dangerous witnesses. But scandal wasn't just about crimes or affairs. It was also about gossip, the lifeblood of downstairs society. Servants loved stories, and they had endless material. Who fainted at dinner? Who flirted outrageously at the ball? Who sent letters that smelled suspiciously of perfume not belonging to their wife? These tales flowed downstairs like spilled wine, retold with relish, embroidered with exaggeration, and swapped over bowls of stew in the servants' hall. Gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was currency. Knowing the juiciest tidbits gave you social clout among your peers, a rare kind of power in a world where most power was denied you. Even gossip about fellow staff could be deadly. A whispered accusation that a maid had sticky fingers, or a hint that a footman spent too long lingering in the ladies' corridor, could poison reputations. The housekeeper and butler, ever the guardians of discipline, listened more closely than they let on. A rumor that reached their ears could mean reassignment to worse duties, or worse, dismissal. Servants lived in constant awareness that their reputations were fragile and that a stray whisper might unravel them. Yet gossip also forged bonds. Shared laughter at a master's embarrassing mistake, or collective outrage at a mistress's cruelty, helped create solidarity among staff. It was a way of reclaiming power, however small. Upstairs, the family believed themselves untouchable. Downstairs, the servants punctured that illusion with sharp words and knowing smiles. Behind the polished doors of the drawing room, the masters might sparkle, but in the servants' hall, everyone knew the stains beneath the shine. What made scandals particularly potent was the Victorian obsession with appearances. Respectability was everything, and the mere suggestion of impropriety could sink social standing. A missing spoon might be overlooked, but a whisper of adultery could ruin a season's worth of careful matchmaking. Families feared their reputations collapsing under the weight of secrets, which gave servants extraordinary leverage, even if they rarely dared use it. The family's fear of exposure made discretion the most prized servant quality. Trustworthy servants could remain in place for decades. Indiscreet ones were gone in days. And then there was the peculiar theatre of cover-ups. Families might quietly dismiss a pregnant maid, claiming she had left for health reasons. A missing piece of silver might be explained as misplaced. Guests who drank too much and embarrassed themselves were politely shielded from consequence by servants who pretended nothing happened. The ability to keep secrets wasn't just part of the job, it was the job. A servant who revealed too much was a liability, but one who guarded secrets faithfully could become invaluable. In the end, the world of scandals, secrets, and gossip was both thrilling and treacherous. It added color to the otherwise grey monotony of service, but it also held real dangers. Servants carried the burden of knowledge, a burden that could be weaponized, twisted, or silenced. They laughed over the family's foibles, whispered about each other's missteps, and sometimes wielded scandal like a dagger. For all the glitter upstairs, the truth of Victorian mansions was this: the walls might have been plastered with silk and gold, but they absorbed every whisper, every sigh, every betrayal. And downstairs those whispers became stories, the kind that made the endless drudgery a little more bearable, even as they could destroy lives in an instant. Victorian mansions weren't static relics. They were laboratories of new technology: gas lamps, flushing toilets, electric bells, and eventually electricity itself all crept into these grand homes. To the families upstairs, these gadgets were signs of progress, symbols of their wealth and modernity. To the servants downstairs, they were often just more things to clean, fix, and maintain. New gadgets promised less work, and somehow created 5 new chores. Take gaslighting. When it first appeared in houses during the early 19th century, it was hailed as a marvel. No more fiddling with dozens of smoky oil lamps. Instead, a whole room could be lit with the turn of a tap. For the master of the house, this meant brighter evenings for reading, entertaining, or writing letters no one would ever reply to. For the servants, however, gaslighting meant scrubbing soot from ceilings and walls, polishing the new fixtures, and keeping a wary eye on leaky pipes that could fill a room with noxious fumes. Worse, gaslight revealed more dust. What looked romantically dim under candlelight suddenly looked embarrassingly dirty under the new glare, which meant more dusting, more polishing, and more hours on ladders. Progress had a way of doubling the cleaning schedule. Plumbing was another convenience that fell heavily on servant shoulders. Early indoor plumbing was temperamental at best. Pipes froze, pumps broke, and toilets, those proud symbols of modern living, overflowed with alarming frequency. Guess who dealt with that? Not the master, not the mistress. It was the unlucky footman or maid armed with a bucket and a nose peg. Baths, too, became more common as plumbing advanced, but heating all that water still required endless hauling and coal burning. A master's leisurely soak meant hours of sweaty labor in the kitchens and sculleries below. Servants joked bitterly that indoor plumbing didn't eliminate their work. It simply relocated it into shinier pipes. And then there were the infamous bell systems. We've already met them in their clanging glory, but technology refined them further. Electric bells arrived in the later Victorian era, replacing clappers with buzzers. Masters thought it miraculous. No more tugging cords, just a button pressed and buzz. A servant appeared. For the servants, the only difference was that now the summons came sharper, more insistent, and somehow even harder to ignore. The household had in effect invented an early version of workplace notifications. Imagine living inside an eternal inbox with no marker's red button. Electricity brought its own mixed blessings. At first it was installed in only the most fashionable homes, used for lighting ballrooms or powering primitive appliances. Upstairs, families marveled at the magic of light on demand. Downstairs, servants grumbled about rewiring, cleaning the fixtures, and adjusting to yet another system that broke as often as it worked. Early electric fittings weren't reliable, and servants became part-time electricians, coaxing stubborn bulbs and wires into function. And of course, brighter light exposed even more dust, even more stains, even more imperfections for them to fix. Electricity didn't so much free them as spotlight their mistakes. Appliances promised salvation but often delivered more hassle. Early mechanical washing machines still had to be cranked by hand. Primitive vacuum cleaners were so bulky they required multiple servants to drag them from room to room, turning time-saving devices into group exercises in futility. Even kitchen gadgets like mechanical beaters or meat grinders needed constant cleaning and maintenance, which added to the workload. The family marveled at their modern convenience, while servants muttered that these miracles always meant extra scrubbing when no one was looking. Technology also changed the pace of life itself. In the candlelit age, darkness was a natural signal to slow down. With gas and electric light, nights stretched longer, allowing families to dine later, host longer parties, and expect service deep into the night. What was once a 12-hour day stretched into 14 or 16. Servants found themselves working later, with less rest, because the masters no longer lived by the rhythm of the sun. Progress, it seemed, meant fewer hours of sleep below stairs. Still, technology wasn't entirely a curse. Some changes did ease certain burdens. Coal scuttles were marginally lighter than hauling endless logs for fires. Plumbing reduced the number of chamber pots maids had to discreetly remove. Laundry eventually became less hellish with mechanical wringers, and for a few forward-looking families, new gadgets meant pride for their staff. At least they weren't stuck in completely medieval conditions. But these gains were modest, and they rarely outweighed the new demands technology created. The irony is that while families upstairs used technology as a status symbol, it was the servants who became the true experts in it. They learned how to maintain gas fixtures, manage boilers, repair pipes, and even troubleshoot early electrical systems. In some ways, Victorian servants became accidental engineers, mastering skills far beyond their official titles. Yet their expertise went unnoticed, buried beneath the assumption that they were just the help. In the grand story of the Victorian mansion, technology revealed the central truth of service. No matter how advanced the gadget, someone still had to operate it, clean it, and repair it. For the family, innovations were conveniences. For the servants, they were complications wrapped in brass and wires. Gas, plumbing, electricity. They all promised progress, but they also tethered servants more tightly to the house, making their labor invisible yet more relentless than ever. And so every new invention came with a sigh downstairs. The masters celebrated the future, while the servants quietly asked, if this is the future, why does it feel like even more work? For Victorian servants, life in service was often compared to a treadmill, endless, monotonous, and impossible to step off without consequence. But eventually, whether through age, exhaustion, or sheer desperation, the question arose, what happens when you leave? The answer was rarely glamorous. Your retirement plan? Hopefully not dying in the laundry room. Marriage was the most common exit strategy, especially for women. Many young maids entered service in their teens, endured years of scrubbing and hauling, and then left once they married a labourer, tradesman, or, in lucky cases, a fellow servant. For some, this was a ticket out of endless drudgery, a chance to establish a home of their own. But home might mean a one-room cottage with a leaking roof and children arriving faster than wages could support them. Marriage wasn't a fairy tale escape. It was a transfer of labor from polishing brass to scrubbing your own hearth. Still, compared to the relentless hierarchy of service, even cramped independence felt like freedom. For men, leaving service often meant seeking work in other industries. Footmen and coachmen sometimes transitioned into jobs as cab drivers, porters, or clerks. But these opportunities weren't always plentiful, and many found themselves trapped. Service paid little, but it at least provided food and a bed. Outside, wages might be higher, but rent, meals, and tools came out of your own pocket. A misstep in the wider world could land a former servant in the dreaded workhouse, the Victorian institution of last resort where poverty was punished with misery. Leaving service for better opportunities could, in reality, mean trading one set of hardships for another. For older servants, particularly those who had devoted decades to one household, there was sometimes the possibility of a pension or small allowance, but sometimes is the operative word. A kind employer might grant a faithful butler or housekeeper a cottage to retire in, or a few pounds a year to survive on. Yet many masters, despite decades of loyal service, offered nothing once a servant was too old or infirm to work. Charity was considered optional, not obligatory, and so elderly servants often ended up living with relatives, surviving on scraps, or relying on parish relief. The idea of a dignified retirement simply didn't exist for most of them. Some tried to parlay their skills into independent ventures. Cooks, for instance, occasionally opened small bakeries or inns, capitalizing on their years of culinary experience. Former ladies' maids might set themselves up as dressmakers, offering skills learned from years of sewing lace and altering gowns. Valets, with their knowledge of tailoring and grooming, sometimes became barbers. These success stories were the exception rather than the rule, but they offered glimmers of possibility for servants determined to reinvent themselves outside the mansion walls. For those less fortunate, destitution was a constant threat. Service was grueling, but it provided shelter, food, and wages, even meager ones. Leaving meant stepping into a world where those guarantees vanished. A maid dismissed for illness or scandal might find no new position, her reputation destroyed by whispers. A footman past his prime, no longer tall and handsome enough for livery, could be cast aside with no prospects. Without savings, many slipped into poverty, a few coins away from the workhouse. The irony was bitter. Years spent upholding another family's wealth could end in your own descent into beggary. The psychological toll of leaving service was profound too. Servants lived within rigid hierarchies, their days dictated by bells and schedules. For years their identities were shaped by uniforms, duties and roles. To suddenly leave that world could feel disorienting. Who were you without the apron, the livery, the endless list of chores? Some ex-servants found it liberating, others terrifying. For those who left to marry or start businesses, the freedom came with responsibility they'd never been allowed before. For those who fell into poverty, the loss of structure made survival even harder. And then there was the social stigma. Servants occupied an odd place in Victorian society, invisible in one sense, but also expected to embody respectability. Leaving service didn't always elevate you in status. A maid who married a farmhand might find herself looked down upon by those who remained in service at a grand house. A footman who became a porter might feel he'd stepped down the ladder rather than up. The prestige of serving a titled family, however hollow it felt, often didn't translate into real-world respect. Still, there were moments of quiet triumph. Some servants saved carefully, penny by penny, over decades, managing to retire with enough to live modestly but independently. Others found lifelong friendships, even marriages within service itself, creating networks that carried them beyond the mansion gates. A rare few even wrote memoirs, giving us today a glimpse of their lives and leaving behind voices otherwise erased by history. For most, though, leaving service was less about happy endings and more about survival, scraping together a new existence after years of being owned by someone else's timetable. In the end, the what's next for Victorian servants was a lottery. One weighted heavily against them. A few escaped into better lives, many transitioned into different kinds of drudgery, and too many ended in poverty. Service didn't prepare you for old age, it drained you in youth and left you vulnerable in later years. The grandeur of the mansion stopped at its walls. Once you walked out the door, you carried only your worn body, your skills, and the faint hope that someone somewhere might offer you more than bread without butter. The Victorian mansion is long gone, at least in the way it once defined daily life. But the servants who kept its wheels turning left behind more than polished brass and boiled laundry water. Their sweat, their discipline, and their invisibility shaped modern work culture in ways we still carry today, often without realizing it. They polished silver so you could polish resumes. First, there's the concept of professionalism. Victorian servants were expected to embody loyalty, discretion, punctuality, and a willingness to put duty above self. Sound familiar? That's because much of what we now call workplace professionalism was forged below stairs. Servants couldn't gossip openly in front of the family, they couldn't be late, and they couldn't refuse orders. The expectation of smiling through fatigue, of presenting a calm, efficient exterior no matter what chaos churned inside, has uncanny echoes in modern customer service jobs. Swap the silver tray for a headset, and suddenly you're a Victorian footman, minus the breeches. Their work also cemented the idea of service as a social category. The rigid hierarchy of the household reinforced who gave orders and who obeyed, who ate lobster and who scraped porridge. That dynamic didn't vanish when the servant class began to shrink. It simply shifted into other forms of employment. Hotels, restaurants, airlines and offices all borrowed the Victorian blueprint, uniforms, etiquette, and a clear line between those who consume and those who provide. If you've ever been trained to blend in, anticipate needs, or always put the client first, you can thank the Victorian housemaid who learned to pour tea silently while being ignored. The lives of servants also left us with cultural awareness about class itself. They revealed, often painfully, the vast gulf between wealth and labour. Victorian society depended on armies of invisible workers, and while today's world has fewer maids dusting drawing rooms, the echoes remain in debates about inequality and unseen labour. The language may have changed, but the tension between upstairs and downstairs is still with us. It just plays out between boardrooms and break rooms, penthouses and delivery bikes, There's also a legacy in domestic technology. Ironically, many of the appliances we now consider indispensable, washing machines, vacuums, dishwashers, were invented to replace or reduce the need for human servants. The very drudgery of the scullery maid or laundry maid inspired the innovations that freed future generations from endless scrubbing. You don't starch collars or haul copper pots of boiling water because someone once did, and society eventually realized it might be easier to let a machine do the misery instead. Servants suffering in a roundabout way fueled convenience for everyone who came after. And then there's the cultural fascination. The stories of servants became part of literature, drama, and later film. From Jane Eyre to Downton Abbey, their lives have captivated audiences precisely because they reveal the hidden machinery of wealth. The glamour upstairs is always counterbalanced by the grind downstairs, and the world loves peeking behind the curtain. That fascination keeps their legacy alive, not just as curiosities of the past, but as mirrors for the present. But perhaps the most striking legacy is empathy, or rather the lack of it. Victorian servants lived lives of invisibility, their identities swallowed by uniforms and duties. They remind us of the millions of workers today whose names are forgotten while their labor keeps systems running. Cleaners, delivery drivers, customer service reps, and countless others who make life effortless for those above them. The Victorians may be gone, but the dynamic hasn't vanished. It has simply changed shape. Of course, not all of the legacy is grim. Servants also demonstrated resilience, resourcefulness, and solidarity. They formed friendships, shared gossip, and found humor in impossible conditions. That same ability to endure, to laugh at the absurdity of being asked to polish brass for the 100th time, remains an essential human survival tactic in workplaces today. If your co-workers share memes about bad bosses or whisper jokes in the break room, you're part of a long tradition that stretches back to maids rolling their eyes at mistresses who couldn't find their own gloves. In the end, the Victorian servant class gave us more than just clean carpets and perfect puddings. They left behind a model of labor discipline, a reminder of social divides, and a trail of inspiration for everything from vacuum cleaners to prestige TV dramas. Their lives, often overlooked in their own time, continue to shape how we think about work, service, and inequality. So the next time you clock in at a job that expects you to smile endlessly, anticipate needs before they're spoken, and perform your role as though your own self doesn't exist, remember, you're standing on the shoulders of those Victorian servants. They may not have resumes to polish, but they set the template for how work would be imagined for centuries. And if you mutter under your breath about the absurdity of it all, congratulations, you're carrying on another vital part of their legacy.